What happens to a fortune built on the distant silence of the wilderness, on the trade of beaver pelts and silence, and the names of rivers that few in cities ever learn to pronounce? What becomes of a family that begins with nothing at a dock, watches empires grow around them as if by patient geometry, and then disappears, not suddenly, but like mist, like something that was never solid at all? Imagine a particular morning, the Hudson River at first light. It is very cold. The water moves in that way only large cold waters move, with a kind of slow, dark intelligence. There is mist, not quite fog, but something between mist and the river's own breath, rising in shapes that do not hold their names. If you could be there, if you were standing on one of the docks that lined the lower Manhattan shoreline in 1785, you would hear the creak of timber, ships settling into their own weight, the minor sounds of water against wood, the sound of a young man climbing from a tender, his shoes wet, his coat too thin for the weather, carrying almost nothing, perhaps a small trunk, a few instruments, a letter of introduction that meant more than the money in his pocket, which was almost nothing at all. You would not know his name yet. You would not know that he would become one of the wealthiest men in America, or that his great-great-grandson would die on another ship, far colder, far more final, in the dark of the Atlantic. You would only see a figure in the mist, doing what countless figures were doing in those years, arriving, beginning, hoping that the city above this dock, the maze of streets rising into April air, would somehow have a place for him. This is the story of the Astor family, not just the merchants, not just the names that appear in histories of New York, but the longer arc of what happens when ambition meets patience, when trade becomes real estate, when a fortune grows so large it becomes almost abstract, a weight that no single person can carry alone, and that no family can hold forever. It is a story that touches the fur trade in its last years, the building of American wealth, the invisible rules of society that the Astors helped write, and finally, tragedy in the cold Atlantic, recorded and remembered and transformed into myth. If you find yourself curious about how empires rise quietly, how families splinter under the weight of their own success, how fortunes built on silence and wilderness can slowly transform into smaller and smaller remnants, I invite you to subscribe for more of these slow histories, documentaries about great dynasties and the patient mathematics of their rise and eventual fall. For now, let us stay with that figure on the dock. Let us go back a little further still, to where he came from, to a place even colder, across an ocean that was itself a wall of mist and time. The year is 1763. The place is Waldorf, a small town in the Rhineland, in what we now know as Germany, though the borders of the world were less certain then, more fluid, more subject to the arguments of kings. It is the kind of place where names matter less than occupations, where people are known by what their hands do rather than by what their children might become. There is a butcher named John Jacob Astor. He is not remarkable. He has a shop. He sells meat. He has children. One of them, the third son, is also called Jacob, John Jacob Astor, the name slightly different from his father's in the German way, but unmistakably the same thread running through two generations, two lives, two moments in time that are separated by nothing more than biology, and the usual human hope that the next generation will do what the last generation could not. When John Jacob Astor the Younger was born, perhaps in 1763, certainly before 1764, the world was not waiting for him. He was not born into wealth. He was not born into nobility. He was the third son of a butcher in a town that appeared on maps mainly by accident. His older brothers had claims on his father's trade, his father's tools, his father's particular knowledge of cuts and prices, and the small reputation he had built around the meat he sold. For a third son in 18th century Germany, there were limited paths forward. You could apprentice into a trade different from your father's. You could leave. You could wait and hope, and most people waited. Young Jacob Astor, it seems, decided something else. He left Waldorf. He travelled first to London, where he lived in some obscurity, perhaps working with an uncle who dealt in musical instruments, flutes and small stringed things that people in London might buy to while away their evenings. He learned the trade. He learned what was valuable, what held its value, what people would pay for when they had already paid for the necessities of survival. Music, beauty, the small luxuries that made life feel less like a series of necessary functions. For a time, this might have been enough. But in London, in the 1780s, there was another knowledge that was becoming impossible to ignore. There was America. The revolution had ended just a few years before. The British had acknowledged American independence. And in America, on the other side of that impossible ocean, there was wilderness, vast, unexplored, unmapped in ways that mattered. And in that wilderness, there were animals with valuable furs, beavers particularly. Beaver fur was desired in Europe and among the growing merchant class of America. It made hats, it made cloaks, it held value the way that almost nothing else could. Perhaps Jacob Astor heard this in London. Perhaps he heard stories from men who had sailed and returned, men who spoke of riches that seemed to come from air and water, and the simple fact of knowing where to find certain animals and knowing how to trade for their skins. Perhaps he thought, as many young men think when they are old enough to want more, but young enough to believe that more was possible, that he could do this, that he could go to America, that he could find his fortune. What would have happened if he had simply stayed in Waldorf, continuing his father's work, selling meat to the people who came to the shop? He would have lived a certain life. He would have been known. He would have been, by the standards of that time and place, comfortable enough. His name would have meant a specific thing to specific people. It would have meant nothing to the rest of the world. Instead, as the 1780s were ending, as the American experiment was still fragile and new, as the world seemed larger and stranger and more full of possibility than it had ever been, young Jacob Astor stood on a dock somewhere in England, or perhaps he walked toward such a dock, carrying whatever he owned, and made a choice that would echo across centuries. He decided to go to America. He decided to leave the known world. He decided to step toward the mist, toward the cold water, toward the possibility of becoming someone new. The crossing itself is a thing lost to time. We do not know which ship he took, or precisely when, or what he experienced during those weeks of travel across an ocean that had been crossed by millions by this point, but which would have felt, to anyone crossing it, like an act of enormous faith. He did not know if he would arrive. He did not know if he would survive. He did not know if the America he had heard about in London bore any resemblance to the America he would find. He only knew that his past was finite, that his future in Waldorf was already written, and that somewhere ahead, weeks away, months away, on the other side of cold, dark water, was the possibility of a different story. The ship, at some point in the late 1780s, arrived. Jacob Astor stepped onto an American dock. The mist, perhaps, looked similar to the mist he had left behind in Europe. The cold was cold. The world was still in the process of becoming. And in that moment, in that particular morning, a fortune began. Not because he was brilliant, not because he was destined, but because he was willing to step off a ship, walk into a city he had never seen, and begin. The story we're about to follow spans nearly 2 centuries, and it asks a question that has haunted historians and observers of wealth since the very beginning. How does a family rise so high that their name becomes synonymous with a nation's power, only to fade so gradually that their disappearance seems almost inevitable? The Astor family is not merely a tale of accumulation. It is a portrait of how one man's quiet ambition could reshape the geography of an entire continent. how his descendants would reinvent themselves across oceans and decades, how a fortune built on the patient purchase of swampland in Manhattan would outlive empires. This is also a story about the moment when destiny seemed to pause, when the wealthiest man in a world still believed itself unsinkable found himself in a cold Atlantic, and when history itself seemed to hold its breath. If you've ever wondered how families sustain power across generations, if you've found yourself curious about the invisible architecture of American wealth, or if you simply wish to understand how the choices made by one person in a German butcher's cottage could echo through ballrooms and parliaments and the construction of cities yet unbuilt, you might consider subscribing for more slow histories of the great dynasties that shaped the world. These are the stories that ask not who won or lost, but how and why and what they left behind. The Astor saga touches so many threads of human history. It weaves through the exploration of a continent at a time when wilderness still seemed endless. It passes through the gilded drawing rooms where women wielded power with the subtlety of silk and silence. It brushes against moments of profound tragedy at sea. It shows us how families splinter when wealth becomes so vast that it can support multiple branches, multiple visions, multiple countries. And it culminates in a slow, patient dissolution that is perhaps more poignant than any sudden catastrophe, because it happens so quietly that observers almost miss it until the absence itself becomes the story. What makes this family worthy of such patient attention is not that they were villains or saints, but that they were ordinary in their ambitions and extraordinary in their consequences. They wanted comfort, security, status. They wanted their children to have more than they had. They wanted to be remembered. These are desires that run through human hearts across all stations and centuries. The Astor family simply had the fortune, quite literally, to pursue these desires on a scale that altered the physical world. We will move through time together, unhurried, beginning with a single man stepping off a ship into a new country with little more than determination and a handful of coins. We will watch as he built, quietly and relentlessly, until his name appeared on deeds that covered vast portions of the growing city of New York. We will walk through the parlors and ballrooms where his descendants held court, where they made and unmade the social hierarchies that governed an entire aristocracy without formal titles. We will witness the elaborate construction of competing palaces born from family dispute. We will follow some of the family into exile in England, where they reinvented themselves yet again, and we will return to America to witness the gradual, inexorable diminishment of their once absolute power. But before we trace these grand movements, it serves us to understand the origins. For the Astor story does not begin in Manhattan. It does not begin in the ballrooms of the 400 or aboard the great ships that carried their names across oceans. It begins far away, in a small town in Germany, in a household of modest means, where a young man was born who would dream of something different. That young man would carry with him an immigrant's hunger, a tradesman's pragmatism, and perhaps something less tangible, a kind of patience, a willingness to wait for returns that might not come for decades. These qualities would compound across time like compound interest itself, and they would build something that outlasted his life by generations. The Astor Empire, when we examine it closely, is an empire of waiting. It is an empire built on the assumption that land would always be worth more than it is today, that patience would always be rewarded, that the future could be purchased now if you only understood where to buy. This philosophy would serve the family well through the 19th century, but it would also, perhaps, make them vulnerable in ways they could not foresee. For there would come moments when the future did not arrive as expected, when the assumptions upon which their wealth rested began to shift like sand. These are the currents we'll explore together in the stretches ahead, moving slowly through each decade and each crucial decision, each turn of fortune and each unexpected tragedy, until we arrive at a place where the Astor name, once as ubiquitous as the streets of New York themselves, becomes something more elusive, preserved in buildings and trusts and the footnotes of history, powerful still, but no longer ascendant. For now, though, we move backward in time, across an ocean, and we return to the beginning of all things Astor, to a moment before names and wealth, before empires, when a single decision to leave home would alter everything that followed. To understand how a man comes to build an empire on the banks of a distant river, we must travel backward through time, across an ocean that would have taken weeks to cross, and into the small, quiet valleys of the German Rhineland in the early days of the 18th century. There, in a place called Waldorf, near Cologne, in a household that bore no particular distinction and commanded no great attention, a boy was born who would one day reshape the economic geography of North America. His name was Johann Jacob Astor, though the world would come to know him by the anglicized version John Jacob. The Waldorf of that era was a modest village, the kind of place where life moved according to rhythms that had barely changed in centuries. The seasons marked the passage of time more reliably than any calendar. Spring brought the thaw and the work of planting. Summer was for growth and gathering. Autumn meant harvest, the filling of stores against the lean months ahead. Winter came with its silence, its compression of human activity into the warmth of hearths and the familiar spaces of home. It was not a place of ambition in the way we think of ambition now. It was a place of sufficiency, of knowing one's station, of accepting the boundaries that had been drawn around one's life long before one was born. John Jacob's father, Johann Jacob Astor the Elder, was a butcher by trade. This was respectable work, necessary work, work that placed a man somewhere in the middle of the village hierarchy, above the landless laborers, below the merchants and landowners who moved with greater freedom through the world. A butcher understood the rhythms of animal husbandry, the seasons of slaughter, the processing of meat into the various forms that would sustain a community through the year. He stood at a particular intersection of necessity and commerce, and if he was competent and honest, he could expect to feed his family and perhaps accumulate a modest comfort as the years passed. We know very little of the elder Astor's character. History has not left us detailed portraits of men in his position. We know that he had children, that he was married, that he worked with his hands and his knowledge. We might imagine him as a steady man, pragmatic, understanding the value of labor and the importance of maintaining one's reputation in a small community, where reputation was one's most valuable possession. But we do not know if he was kind or stern, curious or satisfied, the sort of father who encouraged his children to dream beyond Waldorf, or the sort who expected them to inherit his trade and his station. What we do know is that his son, this young Johann Jacob, possessed something that was neither common nor particularly cultivated in such households. He possessed restlessness. He possessed a quality of mind that looked beyond the boundaries of the village and wondered what lay past them. Perhaps this came from his mother, Magdalena, about whom even less is recorded. Perhaps it was simply the random gift of temperament that some children receive, a fundamental orientation toward possibility rather than acceptance. In the middle years of the 18th century, German-speaking regions of Europe were experiencing subtle but significant pressures, wars of succession, the gradual rearrangement of power among the various princes and kingdoms, the slow movement of trade routes and economic opportunity. These larger forces created small fractures in the settled order of village life. Young men sometimes found themselves conscripted into armies. Sometimes they simply chose to leave, to seek opportunities elsewhere, to test themselves against a wider world. Waldorf was the sort of place from which young men departed, though not often, and not without considerable thought and preparation. By the time he reached his adolescence, young Johann Jacob had apparently decided that his future lay elsewhere. The precise circumstances of this decision remained somewhat veiled. Did his father approve? Did he encourage the boy to seek his fortune, understanding that Waldorf could offer him only the replication of the life he himself was living? Or did the boy possess such a powerful will, such clear conviction about his own destiny, that he simply left, carrying with him whatever his parents could spare and whatever skills they could teach him? What is clear is that by his late teens or early 20s, Johann Jacob Astor had resolved to leave the Rhineland. Before he could establish himself in America, however, he spent some time in London. The reasons for this intermediate step are not entirely documented, though it seems plausible that a young German speaker might gravitate toward London as a place of commerce and opportunity, a city where one could learn the languages and customs of trade, establish contacts, perhaps secure passage to America through connections made among the merchant community there. London, in the mid-18th century, was a global entrepot, a place where the affairs of the wider world concentrated themselves, where fortunes were made and lost, where a young man, with intelligence and determination, might acquire the knowledge necessary to succeed in a distant colony. It was likely in London that Astor began to learn the mercantile arts, to understand how goods moved from source to market, how prices were negotiated, how information about supply and demand traveled along networks of trust. He may have worked for a merchant, served an apprenticeship of sorts, learned to keep accounts and evaluate quality and assess risk. London taught him that the world operated according to principles that were not mystical or dependent upon birth alone, but rational, learnable, available to anyone with the wit to understand them and the determination to master them. And then, at some point in the 1780s, this young man who had been born in a butcher's household in a small German village made the decision that would set the entire trajectory of his life and ultimately the history of his family. He would cross the Atlantic. He would go to America. He would begin again in a place where the old orders held less sway, where a man of intelligence and willingness to work might construct something entirely new from the raw materials of a developing land. The ocean crossing itself remains largely undocumented. We do not know which ship carried him, what the voyage cost, who his fellow travelers were, what he brought with him in terms of possessions or introductions or capital. But we can imagine it, the weeks at sea, the confinement of a ship's hold or a crowded deck, the monotony interrupted by storms, the smell of salt and unwashed bodies, the gradual awareness that one was moving toward a world that was fundamentally and irreversibly different from the one had left behind. When Astor first glimpsed the coastline of America, glimpsed the harbor of New York with its vast natural advantages and its bustling activity, he was no longer a butcher's son from a German village. He had already begun to transform himself into something else entirely. The Atlantic crossing in the autumn of 1783 was a passage that existed largely in the mind before it became a fact of the body. Young John Jacob Astor, perhaps 4 days short of his 21st birthday, had booked passage on a merchant vessel bound for Baltimore, carrying little more than a few guilders in his pocket, letters of introduction from his brother Henry, who had already tried his fortune in London, and a determination that seemed almost unremarkable in its quietness, the kind of resolve that doesn't announce itself with grand gestures, but simply persists, day after day, through the practical work of survival. The crossing itself would have been unremarkable too, had we the testimony to confirm it. The Atlantic in October was what it always was: cold, indifferent, capable of sudden violence but more often simply long and monotonous, a test of patience rather than courage. The ship would have creaked and groaned, the timbers settling into their familiar complaints, the smell of tar and salt and unwashed bodies mingling in the close quarters below deck, where a young man of modest means would have spent most of his time. There are no detailed accounts of Astor's own crossing, no journals or letters describing his fears or his thoughts as he watched the European coastline fade behind him, though it is reasonable to imagine, perhaps more than reasonable, that he felt the weight of finality in that moment. He was leaving behind not poverty exactly, but the absence of possibility. The ceiling that seemed fixed above the head of a younger son in a butcher's family, in a town most of the world would never know. When he arrived in New York in the early months of 1784, the city itself was still raw from revolution, still sorting itself into what it might become. The British occupation had ended less than a year before, and the streets bore the marks of that long conflict. Buildings damaged, population scattered, the economy in a state of cautious reconstruction. New York in 1784 was not yet the center of anything. It was a port city of maybe 10,000 people, a fraction of Philadelphia's size, a place where fortunes might be made or lost with equal ease, which is to say it was an ideal place for someone with nothing to lose and a willingness to watch carefully how others managed their affairs. Astor's first years in the city are remarkably difficult to trace in precise detail, which itself tells a kind of story. He did not announce himself with great transactions or bold ventures. Instead, he moved through the city with the kind of careful attention that suggests he was learning not just the trades available, but the deeper logic of how commerce actually worked in this place, how men built trust, how reputation accumulated slowly through small, consistent dealings. What we know is this. He found work as a clerk for a merchant named Robert Bown who dealt in furs, the pelt trade that was already becoming one of the central engines of profit in the new nation. Bown seems to have recognized something in the young German immigrant, some combination of reliability and hunger, and allowed him access to the business itself. Not merely the drudgery of recording transactions, but the actual substance of how furs moved from the remote interior of the continent down to the ports where they could be shipped to England and Europe, where they would become hats and cloaks and the visible markers of wealth and taste among the upper classes. The fur trade in 1784 was already ancient as an economic system in North America. French traders had been working the rivers and forests for nearly 2 centuries, but it was also in a state of transition. The British monopoly was ending. American traders were beginning to understand that they might compete not just as middlemen, but as principals in the trade itself, and the interior of the continent was opening in the way that frontiers open, with violence and disease and displacement attending the opening, even as great wealth accumulated for those positioned to profit from it. Astor seems to have studied this situation with the kind of patience that suggests he understood something fundamental, that fortunes built on single transactions tend to evaporate, but fortunes built on understanding the pathways along which valuable goods moved, and positioning oneself at those intersection points, those could accumulate and compound. Within a few years of arriving in New York, Astor had established himself as an independent trader in furs. He would have traveled upriver or sent agents to travel upriver into the territories where pelts were obtained, beaver and otter and mink from the waters of the Hudson and beyond, the animal's fur at its thickest and finest when the cold came down from the north. He would have accumulated stock, learned to grade the pelts by quality, understood the precise differences that distinguished a superior beaver skin from a merely adequate one, the knowledge that seems mundane but which separated the profitable trader from the one who merely moved goods without understanding them. At the same time, and this detail is worth lingering over because it reveals something about how Astor's mind worked, he began to trade in musical instruments, pianos, flutes, violins, harpsichords, the instruments that were becoming fashionable among the growing merchant class of New York and Philadelphia, the objects that marked a household as refined and aspiring toward cultural standing. The fur trade and the musical instrument trade seem like entirely unrelated enterprises, and yet there is a logic connecting them. Both involved understanding distant supply chains, both required knowledge of quality and grading, both served markets that were growing as the new nation accumulated wealth. More subtly, perhaps, both required the kind of patient accumulation of knowledge and capital that suggested a mind thinking in terms of years and decades rather than the quick turn of a single transaction. By the 1790s, as the French Revolution was unfolding in Europe and sending shocks through the Atlantic trading world, John Jacob Astor had become a known figure in the New York merchant community. Not yet wealthy, not yet commanding the attention of the city's most powerful men, but established, reliable, quietly accumulating both capital and the knowledge of how capital moved through systems of trade. He had married Sarah Todd, the daughter of a Scots merchant, a marriage that both secured his position among the merchant class and gave him connections to the trading networks that connected New York to other ports. And he had come to understand, through the logic of his own experience, something about the structure of profit and power that would occupy the rest of his life. That in a new nation, land itself, or the rights to land, the control of land, might become the most stable and valuable commodity of all. But that understanding was still forming, still taking shape in his mind as he moved through the streets of the young city, negotiating with trappers and merchants, learning the grades and prices of furs, understanding how an object could begin its existence in the frozen wilderness and end as a luxury adorning the shoulder of a wealthy woman at a ballroom in Philadelphia or New York. By the turn of the 19th century, John Jacob Astor had begun to see the continent in a way that few merchants of his generation could fully imagine. While other traders worked the established routes, buying and selling what others had already mapped, Astor was studying the wilderness itself as a vast, untamed market waiting to be woven into his own hands. The fur trade was not a new thing in America. French trappers had worked the northern territories for more than a century, moving along rivers with their canoes, trading with the indigenous nations who had long understood which animals carried the thickest pelts and when the seasons made the trapping profitable. But Astor saw something in this ancient knowledge that others saw as merely local custom. He saw it as the foundation of an empire, the American Fur Company, which Astor established gradually through acquisition and consolidation between 1808 and 1810, was designed to do something unprecedented on this continent. It was designed to monopolize not just one trade route or one region, but the entire fur trade of the interior, to reach into the Rocky Mountains, down to the Columbia River, across the Great Lakes, and the northern tributaries where beaver and mink and fox moved through the darkness of the forest. Think for a moment about the sheer ambition of this vision. Astor had never himself trapped a single fur or paddled a canoe through white water. He had never lived in the wilderness or learned the languages of the nations whose lands he meant to control. Yet through a network of agents, managers, and what we might call early supply chain logistics, he was proposing to do something that required not muscle and wilderness skill, but organization, capital, and the cold calculation of profit across vast distances. The routes that emerged under this system were routes of profound difficulty. Canoe brigades would set out from Montreal, paddling west through the Great Lakes, then striking out into waters so remote that the men traveling them might not see another European face for months at a time. These were not leisurely journeys. The pace was relentless. Paddlers would wake before dawn, load their canoes with trade goods and supplies, and work the water sometimes 18 hours a day, portaging around waterfalls and rapids, pulling their craft over land to avoid the worst of the current. The trading posts that dotted this network, Michilimackinac, Fond du Lac, the posts along the Missouri and the Columbia, were small fortified enclosures, often built on the highest ground overlooking the river, necessary because these were not places where the American government's authority extended. Law, such as it was, came from the fur company itself. It was at these posts that the real business of the Astor system took shape. Trade goods flowed in, bolts of cloth, metal goods, firearms, ammunition, blankets, and crucially, alcohol, which had become so central to the fur trade that many posts kept it under lock. The furs flowed out, packed in bales, eventually reaching the Chinese market, where beaver pelts in particular commanded premium prices among merchants who wanted the fur for the finest hats that European fashion demanded. And between these two flows of commerce, between the goods arriving and the furs departing, moved the men whose labor made the entire apparatus possible. The French-Canadian voyageurs who worked these routes, men descended from the old fur-trading families of Quebec and Montreal, were skilled boatmen, tougher than the voyageurs deserved to be. They were not enslaved, though historians have sometimes used that word to describe their condition, and it is worth pausing on that distinction. They were paid, though poorly, and they were technically free to leave, though the geography of North America made leaving from the interior something close to impossible. They lived on provisions supplied by the company, worked under conditions that would seem unimaginable today, and rarely accumulated wealth despite the fortunes their labor generated. Disease claimed many of them, particularly scurvy from diets lacking fresh vegetables during the long winters in remote posts, accidents on the water, drowning, broken limbs from capsizing in rapids, were occupational hazards that the company accepted as the cost of doing business. Alongside the voyageurs worked men called engagés, hired hands who took on the lowest status work, loading and unloading canoes, cutting firewood, maintaining the posts. Some were indigenous men who had entered the system out of necessity or because it offered seasonal income. Others were Europeans, sometimes men fleeing debts or family troubles, men for whom the offer of work in the distant wilderness was salvation or escape depending on one's perspective. They too were paid minimally and supplied with subsistence rations, their labor extracted not through coercion exactly, but through the simple fact that their alternative was starvation. And then there were the trappers themselves, the men who actually ventured into the mountains and forests with their traps, spending weeks alone or in small parties, enduring cold that could kill in hours if a person became lost. Some were French-Canadian, some American, some Scottish men who had come north from the United States. They were not quite employees in the modern sense. They worked partly on commission, buying their supplies from the company store at prices that left them perpetually indebted. This system, sometimes called the dette-pionnage trap, meant that even a successful trapper who returned with dozens of valuable pelts might find his profits evaporated in the cost of goods he had purchased at inflated prices while in the wilderness. But what cost is truly incalculable in the history of the fur trade is the cost borne by the indigenous nations whose territories these systems invaded. The trade itself was not entirely new to them. For generations before Astor, indigenous trappers and hunters had exchanged furs with Europeans, incorporating European goods into their own economies and societies. What changed was the scale and the monopolistic intent. As the American Fur Company expanded, it worked to exclude competitors and to bind indigenous suppliers into a relationship of dependence on company goods. Prices for furs were controlled by the company, set low. Prices for trade goods, particularly alcohol, were set high. The result was a slow erosion of indigenous autonomy, a gradual shift from trade relationships based on mutual benefit to economic systems that drained resources from native territories without equivalent return. The most insidious aspect of this was perhaps the introduction of alcohol on an unprecedented scale. Alcohol had been part of the fur trade for a long time, but under Astor's system, it became weaponized in a manner that was deliberately destructive. The company recognized that alcohol was an exceptionally profitable trade good, and that intoxication weakened people's judgment in negotiations. A trapper, or an indigenous hunter who drank, might trade valuable furs for goods worth a fraction of their value. More darkly, over time, the introduction of alcohol in large quantities contributed to the social disruption of indigenous communities, to health crises, and to an increasing dependence on the trade system itself as a way to sustain access to alcohol that had become chemically and socially addictive. The environmental cost was equally significant, though it was less consciously understood at the time. As the fur trade expanded under Astor, the beaver populations of the northern continent were systematically depleted. Beavers, which had once existed in numbers that seemed infinite, were trapped at rates that far exceeded their reproductive capacity. Ecosystems that had been shaped by beaver activity, the wetlands and ponds that beaver dams create, began to disappear. Rivers changed their character. Wildlife populations that depended on these habitats declined. This was not something the Astor Company set out to do, but it was an inevitable consequence of organizing the entire continental fur trade for maximum extraction and profit. Consider the perspective of a person living in these territories in the year 1820 or 1830. Perhaps you were a member of a nation that had lived in a particular region for centuries, that understood the seasonal movements of animals, that had relationships with the land that were woven into language and ceremony and daily practice. Over a generation or two, that landscape would change. The animals would become fewer. The traders would multiply. The relationships with European and American merchants would become more intrusive, more demanding. The goods that had arrived as exotic luxuries would become necessities, and the pathways into economic dependence would seem, by then, impossible to escape. Meanwhile, at the centers of this vast network, in Astor's offices in New York, where he received reports on shipments and profits, the scale and suffering of these transformations were abstracted into neat columns of figures. Bales of pelts arrived, were processed, were sold to European manufacturers and Chinese merchants. The money that returned to New York was real and vast and relentless in its accumulation. By 1820, John Jacob Astor was the wealthiest man in the United States, his fortune built on the organized extraction of resources from territories he had never seen and from the labor of men whose names he would never know. In the spring of 1811, a small ship named the Tonquin departed from New York with something that had never been attempted before, at least not with such calculated ambition. John Jacob Astor had conceived of a plan so distant, so improbable in its scope, that it would occupy him for years, even as he continued his quiet accumulation of Manhattan streets and vacant lots. He would establish a fur trading post at the mouth of the Columbia River, on the far western coast of the American continent, in territory that was claimed by no nation with any certainty, in a place so remote that communication with the eastern seaboard would take many months, if it arrived at all. The expedition itself was a marvel of logistics. Astor sent not only trappers and traders, but craftsmen, soldiers, mechanics. The Tonquin carried trade goods, seeds, livestock, the seeds of an entire civilization meant to root itself in wilderness. One can imagine the ship's hold in those dawn hours before departure, the peculiar mixture of civilization and improvisation, bolts of cloth next to axes, trinkets for trade beside iron implements, the whole venture bound together less by certainty than by Astor's quiet conviction that it could succeed. The journey itself would take many months, rounding Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, navigating seas that few merchant vessels had attempted. There was danger in every coordinate crossed. The Columbia River, when the Tonquin finally arrived, was not a harbor of welcome. The coastline was rocky, treacherous. Autumn storms were already gathering over the Pacific. The landscape itself seemed indifferent to Astor's ambitions. Dense forests rose abruptly from the shore. The water was cold and dark. The indigenous peoples who inhabited the region had their own established patterns of trade and territory. And yet, in this improbable place, a settlement began to take form. It was given the name Astoria, a straightforward claim of ownership, written directly into the landscape itself. Astor would never see this place. He remained in New York, superintending his other enterprises, while others built his Western dream. Astoria's first years were difficult in ways that only isolation can create. The nearest center of European settlement was Fort Vancouver, held by the British Northwest Company, far enough away to feel like a rival rather than a neighbor. Communication with New York took so long that decisions made in Manhattan were often obsolete by the time they arrived on the Columbia. Supplies ran low. The hunting was not always successful. Men grew restless in this remote corner of the continent. Some died. Others deserted into the surrounding wilderness, drawn by the life of independent trappers rather than the discipline required by Astor's enterprise. The settlement's population fluctuated. There were moments when it seemed that the entire venture might collapse, that the forest and the river would simply absorb this thin thread of American ambition and leave no trace. And yet for a time, Astoria functioned. Pelts accumulated. Trade networks extended inland. There is something oddly moving about reading the records of daily life in this remote post, the cataloguing of goods, the notations about the health of animals, the careful accounting that Astor's mercantile mind required even at the continent's edge. Men built cabins, they cleared land, they developed relationships, however fraught, with the local tribes who possessed the knowledge necessary for survival. Astor's vision, however distant his physical presence, had shaped this small human settlement out of forest and isolation. It was, for a brief moment, his greatest achievement, the most tangible proof that his ambitions could become real and three-dimensional. But the War of 1812 arrived like a storm that had been gathering on a distant horizon, invisible until it was suddenly upon you. The conflict between the United States and Britain transformed the commercial landscape. The British, already established at Fort Vancouver and elsewhere in the region, became officially an enemy power. Astoria, isolated and small, suddenly seemed indefensible. The economics that had barely sustained it became impossible. Trade routes were disrupted. Communication with the East became more dangerous. Insurance on ships became prohibitively expensive. What had been a marginal venture became, under the pressure of war, something closer to impossible. In 1813, less than 2 years after Astor had poured so much capital and hope into the settlement, he was forced to make a calculation that, one suspects, caused him genuine pain. The post could not be held against British pressure. The investment could not be protected. It was better to liquidate, to cut losses, to acknowledge that even John Jacob Astor could not maintain an outpost of empire at the edge of the world when the world itself had become hostile. He sold Astoria to the Northwest Company, his rival, at a loss that was substantial by the standards of the time, though not catastrophic. The post that bore his name, the settlement he had founded in such remote and difficult territory, would pass to others. It would eventually become part of the British domain, when Britain and the United States settled the question of territorial boundaries through diplomatic negotiation rather than continued warfare. There is something almost poignant about Astoria's brief, bright history. It was Astor's most romantic venture, the furthest reach of his ambition, a place where he tried to impose not merely commerce, but order and permanence upon the wilderness. And it failed, not because it was poorly managed or illogically conceived, but because the great currents of history, the movements of empires and wars and international rivalries, were larger than any single man's vision. Astor would learn from this. The lesson, perhaps, was that the Columbia River was too distant, too contested, too difficult to hold. But Manhattan, the streets and blocks and neighborhoods of New York City, those he could hold, they would not be taken by foreign powers. They would only grow more valuable with time. Perhaps this was what the loss of Astoria taught him. Not that his ambitions were too large, but that they had been aimed in the wrong direction. By the early 1800s, as the American Fur Company stretched its tentacles across the wilderness and the wealth accumulated in John Jacob Astor's hands, something quietly shifted in his thinking. The fur trade had made him rich, yes, but it was a trade dependent on supply chains that reached into territories he could not control, on the hunts of men whose loyalty was never certain, on fashion's fickle turning. And perhaps, as he moved through New York with increasing prominence, he began to notice something that would prove far more durable than beaver pelts or muskrat hides. He began to notice the city itself, the way it crept northward year by year, the way land values rose with each new street laid down, each new neighborhood settled. He began to understand that the true fortune would not be made from what came out of the earth in distant forests, but from owning the earth itself, in the place where people most wanted to be. The shift was not dramatic. There was no single moment when Astor abandoned the fur trade or made a grand declaration. Instead, it was gradual, almost imperceptible, a slow reallocation of capital and attention. He had already begun acquiring parcels in Manhattan during his fur trading years, but now the purchases accelerated, became more systematic, more patient. He bought land not for immediate development but for holding, for waiting, for the simple faith that New York would continue to grow and that those who owned its soil would inevitably become wealthier. It was a logic born perhaps from watching the wilderness itself, understanding how natural resources renewed themselves, how a forest could be harvested and would grow again. But land in a city could only ever become scarcer. What made this transformation remarkable was how little fanfare accompanied it. Astor did not boast of his real estate holdings as he had quietly spoken of his trading posts and ships. He simply bought. He bought a farm on what is now Greenwich Village. He acquired parcels along Broadway. He gathered blocks and lots and parcels with the methodical patience of a man collecting tiles for a mosaic whose full picture would only be visible to those who came after him. By 1810, his real estate holdings were already substantial, and by 1820, they had become the foundation of his wealth, a foundation that would prove infinitely more stable than the fluctuating prices of fur. There was a particular wisdom in this choice that speaks to something deeper in Astor's character than mere calculation. He had come to America with nothing but ambition and a willingness to work. He had built himself upward through the fur trade, yes, but he had also understood something that many of his contemporaries missed, that the game would eventually change. Fashions fade, territorial advantages dissolve, competitors emerge. But the island of Manhattan was fixed, permanent, irreplaceable. Its growth was not a matter of speculation, but of historical inevitability. Every new immigrant who arrived at the harbor needed somewhere to live. Every new business needed somewhere to operate. The demand for land could only increase. The landscape of his acquisitions tells a story of remarkable foresight, though one must be careful not to overstate this. Some of his purchases were fortunate timing. Some were perhaps educated guesses based on the patterns he observed. But the cumulative effect was undeniable. He bought tracts of land that were considered marginal, undeveloped, far from the center of the city's commerce. Imagine standing with Astor in 1805, looking northward from Lower Manhattan into what was then essentially rural countryside. Why, a skeptic might have asked, would one spend good money on fields and marshland so far from the seat of civilization? The answer, from Astor's perspective, was simple and patient, because the city would grow into these fields, because what was wilderness today would be fashionable address tomorrow. And indeed, as the decades progressed, the prophecy fulfilled itself. The neighborhoods that Astor had foreseen began to take shape. Broadway extended northward. New streets were laid in grid patterns. Brownstones began to appear where there had been farmland. The value of the land multiplied, not through any action of Astor's, but through the inevitable expansion of a thriving city. He had done nothing more than wait and allow history to work in his favor. Consider the psychology of this shift for a moment. A man who has made his fortune through active trade, through the management of voyages and trading posts and networks of commerce, might be expected to continue in that mode. Yet Astor seems to have recognized that true generational wealth required a different approach. He moved from doing to holding, from creating to waiting. It is a subtle distinction but a crucial one. The fur trade demanded constant attention, constant vigilance, constant engagement. Real estate asked only for patience and occasional decisions about when to develop a plot or when to hold it yet longer. By the time he reached his 60s, Astor had largely withdrawn from the day-to-day operations of the American Fur Company. Others managed those affairs now. His attention had turned toward Manhattan, toward the surveys and maps and property deeds that represented his vision of the city's future. He had begun to think in terms of what would last beyond his lifetime, what would continue to generate wealth for his descendants long after his own breath had ceased. The fur trade, for all its romance, could not offer this assurance. Land, in a city as vital as New York, could offer nothing else. There is something almost meditative in contemplating Astor's real estate acquisitions, the methodical patience with which he accumulated acres and lots and parcels across Manhattan. It reflects a man who had learned to think in terms of decades and centuries rather than seasons and years. The trappers in the wilderness hunted according to the rhythms of nature. Astor had learned to hunt according to the rhythm of history itself, the slow, inexorable process by which a frontier settlement becomes a great city, by which wild land becomes valuable property. He was not racing against time, but moving with it, letting it carry his ambitions forward while he simply maintained his grip on the soil beneath the city's feet. By the 1820s, it was clear that Astor's gamble had paid dividends. His real estate holdings were worth far more than his fur company could ever generate. The rents from his properties provided a steady, reliable income that required none of the management or risk inherent in shipping furs across oceans or managing wilderness trading posts. He had transformed himself from a merchant into a landlord, from a trader into a holder of land, from a man whose fortune depended on the success of distant ventures into a man whose fortune depended only on the continued growth and vitality of the city in which he lived. The transition also carried within it a certain acknowledgement of mortality, though perhaps Astor himself did not see it in such stark terms. By moving his wealth into Manhattan real estate, he was placing it into something that would outlast him. The fur trade would fade or persist based on fashion and nature and competition. But the land under Manhattan would remain, would only increase in value, would pass to his heirs as a form of wealth that required no active management, no constant vigilance. It was wealth in its purest form, the simple ownership of a place that others needed. By the 1840s, John Jacob Astor had become something far removed from the young man who had arrived in New York with nothing but a German accent and the certainty that he could build something. The fur trade, which had consumed his ambitions for nearly half a century, had begun to fade from the landscape of his wealth. The great rivers where his men had trapped and suffered were becoming navigable corridors for settlers rather than sources of empire. The beaver population, hunted nearly to extinction across the continent, could no longer sustain the fortunes they once had. Nature itself had withdrawn its bounty, and Astor, ever the pragmatist, had already moved his capital elsewhere. His real estate holdings in Manhattan had grown into something almost abstract in their vastness. Where once he had purchased lots at the edges of the city, beyond the reach of ordinary commerce, the city had simply grown around and through his acquisitions. The land he had bought for nearly nothing had become the foundation upon which New York was building itself. Block after block, street after street, the grid of the expanding city was increasingly his to lease and control. He was no longer primarily a merchant or a trader. He had become something quieter and, in its way, far more powerful, a landlord to a nation's ambition. The man himself had grown old in a manner befitting his station. By his 70s, Astor maintained a kind of austere dignity, the sort that comes not from great beauty or charm, but from the simple fact of persistent presence. He had outlived most of his contemporaries. He had watched younger men rise and fall, build fortunes and see them dissolve like morning mist on the river. He remained. Contemporary accounts describe a figure still dignified in bearing, though slowed by age and the accumulated weight of so many years of calculation. Some who encountered him remarked upon a certain coldness, a distance that suggested a mind perpetually engaged in some distant accounting. Was this the natural consequence of a life spent measuring everything in terms of profit and loss, or simply the reserve of a man who had learned early that sentiment was a luxury affordable only to those without much to lose? In his final years, Astor's primary residence was Hellgate, a grand estate he maintained on the East River, though he maintained property in such number and variety that any true accounting of his holdings would require a team of clerks working for weeks. The house itself reflected the tastes of his era, substantial, furnished with the sort of heavy elegance that wealth required, but not ostentatious in the way that would come to characterize the Astors in later generations. He lived, it seemed, more from habit than from any genuine desire for the luxuries that his wealth could have procured. He was a man who had accumulated not to enjoy, but because the accumulation itself had become the purpose. His only legitimate son, William Backhouse Astor, had already begun to take on the stewardship of the vast estate. This, too, was part of Astor's careful design. He had structured everything with an eye toward continuity and control. The empire, as he conceived of it, was not meant to die with him. It was meant to persist, to grow through the hands of his heirs, to become so woven into the fabric of the city that it would be impossible to separate the Astor name from the city itself. In this, perhaps more than in any other endeavor, he succeeded completely. There are records of his life in those final years that paint a portrait of a man approaching the end with remarkable equanimity. He walked through the city he had shaped, observing the changes, noting the growth. One contemporary account describes him standing on a street corner in Lower Manhattan, watching construction work, and remarking simply that the area would become valuable in time. Even in his final years, even when the accumulation of wealth was no longer a necessity for comfort or security, his mind returned inevitably to the logic of real estate, to the patient certainty that time and growth would vindicate any purchase made with careful thought. His health began its final decline in 1848. The record is spare on details, as was customary for men of his standing. Medical science at that time could offer little beyond comfort, and comfort was something he could certainly afford. The physicians of the day would have attended him with deference, though their remedies would have been largely ineffective against the simple weight of age. He seems to have faced this final passage with the same methodical acceptance he had brought to everything else in his life. There is no record of complaint, no indication of the sort of spiritual searching that sometimes characterized the last days of great men. When John Jacob Astor died on March 29, 1848, he was in his mid-80s, having lived longer than most men of his generation could reasonably expect. The newspapers of New York marked his passing with the sort of reverent attention reserved for the founding fathers of commerce. They spoke of his vision, his shrewdness, his role in the development of the nation. Some editorialists reflected on the moral implications of his vast wealth, but these reflections were muted by the general sense of admiration for what he had built. He had become, in his final decades, a kind of institution himself, less a man than a force of nature. His estate was estimated, with the caution that always attends such calculations, at somewhere between $20 and $30 million. This figure, almost incomprehensible in the currency of his era, placed him among the wealthiest men not merely in America, but in the world. Much of this wealth was bound up in New York real estate, land that could not be easily divided or sold without diminishing its value. His will reflected this reality. The bulk of the estate was left to his son William Backhouse Astor, with the express intention that the holdings be maintained and, if possible, expanded. There were bequests to charity, as propriety demanded, but these were measured and careful, the donations of a man who gave from duty rather than generosity. With his death, an era closed. The fur trade, which had been the foundation of his wealth, passed into history. The American Fur Company, the sprawling enterprise that had stretched from New York to the Pacific coast, dissolved into insignificance. The posts and the trappers and the vast logistics of moving beaver pelts across an unforgiving continent faded into memory. The wilderness itself, even then, was being transformed into something that could be bought and sold, mapped and controlled. What remained was land. What persisted was the simple, patient accumulation of real estate, the quiet logic of ownership that required only patience, and the certainty that a growing city would eventually make valuable anything purchased with care. John Jacob Astor, who had come from nothing, who had built an empire in furs and risk, left behind something far more durable than adventure. He left behind property, and through property, power that would outlast his name by generations. The city itself became his monument, not built as an intentional memorial, but simply as the inevitable consequence of growth and commerce flowing through the channels he had shaped and the land he had owned. In the quiet years after his death, his son would tend to this inheritance, not with the fierce acquisitiveness of the founder, but with the careful stewardship of a man who understood that his role was preservation and modest addition to what had already been built. The great fortune would endure. The family name would become synonymous with New York itself, and though John Jacob Astor himself was gone, the logic of his life, the patient accumulation, the faith in real estate, the certainty that time favored the careful landlord, would shape not merely his own family's future, but the development of an entire city. When John Jacob Astor closed his eyes for the last time in the spring of 1848, the empire he had built did not collapse into sentiment or dispute. There was no dramatic auction, no tearful farewell to the fur posts of the North, no ceremony marking the end of an era. Instead, what passed into the hands of his son was something far more durable than adventure, a vast, patient accumulation of Manhattan real estate that would, in its own quiet way, outlive fur routes and trading posts by centuries. William Backhouse Astor Sr. inherited not the glamour of his father's rise but its fruit, a portfolio of properties that stretched across the island like a slowly tightening net. He was, by all accounts, a man of lesser imagination than his father, but perhaps greater wisdom. Where John Jacob had been restless, ambitious, forever scanning the horizon for the next venture, William Backhouse seemed content to tend what had been planted. He was the steward rather than the adventurer, the gardener rather than the explorer. The properties his father had acquired during those years of real estate speculation now demanded patient management. The land around what would become Washington Square, the long blocks of Lower Manhattan, the holdings that stretched northward into areas that were still, in the 1840s and 1850s, mostly open fields and scattered farmhouses, these were the true inheritance. And William Backhouse understood something that many men of great fortune have never grasped, that the value of silence and continuity often exceeds the value of spectacular action. Consider for a moment what it means to hold land in a growing city for decades without selling. There is a kind of faith embedded in that choice, a faith that the future will be worth more than the present, that patience will be rewarded by the simple fact that human beings cluster together, that they need shelter, that they will pay ever-increasing sums for the privilege of standing on a particular piece of stone and soil. William Backhouse lived this faith without needing to speak it aloud. During his stewardship, the Astor holdings began to achieve what might be called architectural and social consolidation. The family was no longer merely wealthy, they were beginning to be woven into the very physical fabric of New York City. Their name was not yet emblazoned on hotels or written into society pages with the kind of obsessive attention that would follow, but their presence was becoming undeniable. The properties were rented to merchants, to families seeking respectable addresses, to the emerging professional classes of the city. And here, in the quiet expansion of these holdings, lay a kind of power that John Jacob had perhaps understood intuitively, but had never needed to articulate. The man who owns the land owns the future. The man who owns the ground beneath other people's feet shapes the contours of their lives whether they acknowledge it or not. William Backhouse Astor seemed to grasp this with an almost monastic acceptance. He did not need to be famous. He did not need to build monuments to himself in the way that other men of fortune felt compelled to do. What was William Backhouse himself, beyond the inheritance he maintained? The historical record offers us fragments. He married Dorothea Langdon, a woman of respectable family, and they had children who would themselves become important to the family's trajectory. There are hints in contemporary accounts of a man of moderate temperament, reliable in his dealings, careful with money in a way that suggested not miserliness, but rather a kind of professional respect for capital as a tool rather than an ornament. The 1850s and 1860s saw the expansion of his responsibilities accelerate as the city itself grew in ways that no one, perhaps, could have fully anticipated. The Civil War brought disruptions and opportunities. The aftermath brought enormous growth. Manhattan's center of gravity began shifting northward in earnest, and the Astor holdings, many of which had been nearly valueless rural tracts when John Jacob acquired them, began to transform into some of the most desirable real estate in the world. One might wonder, how does a man maintain focus through such transformation? How does one hold steady while the world reshapes itself around your properties, increasing their worth almost without your intervention? Perhaps the answer lies in understanding that William Backhouse Astor was not watching the world change. He was watching his inheritance appreciate. His role was not to create value but to preserve it, to ensure that it was neither squandered nor mismanaged, to pass it forward in undiminished form to the next generation. In an age increasingly characterized by industrial frenzy, by the building of railroads and factories, by the loud competition for advantage, William Backhouse Astor simply waited. He collected rents, he maintained properties, he attended to details, he grew older. The family wealth, in his capable if undramatic hands, became more solid, more established, less dependent on any single venture or the whims of any single man. By the time William Backhouse Astor Sr. died in 1875, he had accomplished something perhaps more difficult than his father's original accumulation. He had stabilized it. He had not lost it to speculation or recklessness. He had not fragmented it through careless distribution. Instead, he had consolidated it, enlarged it through the patient operation of compound returns, and positioned it for inheritance by a new generation that would inherit not only wealth, but also the example of how such wealth might be maintained and deployed. And yet, within that consolidation, seeds of future division had already been planted. When John Jacob Astor died in 1848, his empire did not pass as a single inheritance to a single heir. Instead, the vast machinery of wealth he had constructed, real estate holdings that now stretched across Manhattan, properties whose value seemed to grow with each passing season regardless of economic tide, divided itself, almost naturally, between his sons. And from that moment of division, something else began to divide as well, the family's sense of itself as one unified entity. What had been a coherent vision, held in the mind of a single man who had crossed an ocean with nothing and built something from the fur-soaked wilderness, now split into separate visions, separate ambitions, separate understandings of what it meant to be an Astor. The elder son, William Backhouse Astor, received what might be called the stewardship. He inherited not only substantial properties, but also the temperament, some said, of his father, quiet, methodical, interested in the slow mathematics of land acquisition and rents. William Backhouse Astor was born in 1792, 3 years before his father arrived in America, and he had grown up watching the accumulation, learning its rhythms by osmosis. He understood that the real fortune lay not in movement or novelty, but in stillness, in owning what others needed, in the patience required to wait while a swamp became a street, and a street became a neighborhood, and a neighborhood became one of the most valuable parcels of real estate in the world. But there was also a second son, John Jacob Astor III. Younger by 5 years, born in 1797, he too inherited wealth and land, though not in precisely the same proportions as his brother. And therein lay the beginning of something that would echo through the decades to come. Not a dramatic rupture, but a gentle, persistent divergence. John Jacob III seemed drawn toward something different than his brother's quiet consolidation. He was curious, in a different register, where William Backhouse Astor looked down and measured the ground beneath his feet. John Jacob III sometimes looked upward, outward, across the Atlantic with the kind of gaze that suggested the Hudson River, for all its significance, was perhaps not the only river in the world that mattered. The younger Astor had interests that his brother seemed content to leave alone. He involved himself in the mechanics of cultural life in New York. He was a patron of music, of libraries, of institutions. This was not unusual for a wealthy man of his era. Philanthropy was, in many ways, a form of monument building, a way of inscribing your name on the city's consciousness in stone and brass. Yet there was something in John Jacob III's approach that suggested a genuine curiosity about ideas, about knowledge, about the cultivation of the intellectual life alongside the accumulation of property. As the 1840s gave way to the 1850s, these two men, half-brothers really, sharing a name and a fortune and a legacy, but not entirely the same priorities, began to move in somewhat different circles, to develop somewhat different networks, to build power in different registers. William Backhouse Astor consolidated. He bought more land. He married well, connecting the Astor name with other old money families whose lineage reached back into the colonial period. He lived quietly, almost, for a man of such enormous means. He did not seek attention. He sought returns. John Jacob III, meanwhile, seemed more inclined toward the visibility that great wealth could purchase. Not ostentation exactly. The Astors were never quite comfortable with pure, vulgar display, but a kind of strategic prominence. He was involved in libraries and musical institutions. He took an interest in the running of the American Fur Company, the enterprise that had been the original generator of the family's wealth, even as its dominance was beginning to fade in the face of new economic forces, new patterns of trade and settlement. Neither brother fought openly with the other. There is little record of serious conflict, of dramatic family ruptures. This was partly temperament, partly the fact that the fortune seemed large enough, the real estate empire vast enough, that both men could pursue their separate interests without direct competition. And yet the seed was planted in these years of gentle divergence, separate branches, separate ambitions, separate understandings of what power meant and what it was for. The consequences would take generations to fully flower. But already, in these mid-19th century years, observers of the Astor family could sense it. There would be no simple succession, no single heir to carry forward the vision of John Jacob in its original form. Instead, the family was beginning to fracture, almost imperceptibly, into lineages. There would be the Astor who prioritized real estate, who lived quietly, who accumulated wealth with the patience of a man tending a garden. And there would be the Astor who looked toward culture, toward society, toward visibility and influence exercised through institutions and connections, rather than merely through land. Neither approach was inherently superior. Both represented legitimate forms of power. Both represented legitimate interpretations of what one did with an enormous inherited fortune in a rapidly changing nation. But they were different enough that, as decades passed and as circumstances changed, they would begin to pull the family in different directions entirely. The Astor name would no longer mean one thing, it would mean several things, and that multiplication of meaning, that fracturing of the family identity, would shape everything that came after. For now, in the calm of the mid-19th century, this divergence was gentle, almost invisible. The brothers maintained their relationship. They existed in the same social world. They owned properties in the same city. But the logic of inheritance, the logic of individual temperament, the logic of history itself, the way that great fortunes never quite stay together in the way that their founders imagined, was already at work, dividing the dynasty even as it continued to expand in raw material terms. The Astor fortune was growing, but the Astor family already was becoming many families. By the closing decades of the 19th century, New York had become something entirely new, a vertical and social architecture so precise in its hierarchies that one might compare it to a Swiss watch, each gear settling into its immutable place. The Astors, having accumulated their fortress of Manhattan real estate, found themselves no longer merely wealthy merchants or trading partners. They had become something far more influential and far more constrained. They were society itself, or at least its gatekeepers, and in that transformation lay the peculiar burden of their ascendance. Picture, if you will, the ballrooms of the 1880s and 1890s. Imagine the soft golden glow of electric light, still a novelty, still a marker of immense privilege, falling across parquet floors that had been brought from Europe, or laid by craftsmen who understood that the dance of the elite required a surface without flaw. The brownstones of Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue, with their limestone facades and their interior courts hidden from public view, became the theaters where an entirely unwritten code of conduct was performed with the precision of ballet. These were not merely buildings, they were statements, declarations of permanence in a city that was changing faster than perhaps any city on earth. The architecture itself whispered the invisible rules. A townhouse on the correct block of Fifth Avenue communicated something that a townhouse on a parallel street could never quite convey. The distance between acceptability and exclusion might be measured in the length of a single Manhattan block. Who understood this logic better than those who owned the blocks themselves? The Astors had spent generations acquiring the parcels on which these grand homes would rise, and now they inhabited them as both residents and landlords, benefiting doubly from the prestige they helped to create. What made old New York society, that peculiar phrase which itself would have been meaningless before the Civil War, so quietly powerful was its resistance to definition? There were no official roles, no published membership lists, no organizations with letterhead that announced themselves as arbiters of taste. Yet everyone who mattered knew precisely where they stood. The rules governing which families might attend which balls, which marriages would be deemed suitable, which young women would be presented as debutantes worthy of the name, these rules operated like an invisible nervous system, communicated through the smallest gestures, through the architecture of social events, through the careful placement of names in the society pages of newspapers. The ballrooms themselves were laboratories of hierarchy. A woman entering one of these vast chambers would have observed, perhaps without conscious awareness, the subtle gradations of positioning. Where was she standing in relation to the windows? How far from the orchestra? Which other women were being approached by the men of consequence, and which were permitted to stand in the quieter corners, their status somehow diminished by mere proximity? These spatial arrangements were not accidental. They were the physical manifestation of a social calculus so complex that to write it down would have seemed almost vulgar, as if one were publishing the secret formulas of an ancient order. The Astors understood this language, or perhaps more accurately, they had become so thoroughly fluent in it that it no longer felt like learning at all. To be an Astor in New York in this era was to be born into the upper register of a system that you would simultaneously shape through your mere presence. It was a strange position, powerful yet constrained, influential yet bound by custom and expectation. A woman could not simply wear what she wished, though her wealth might have permitted her to commission the finest gowns in Paris. She wore what was appropriate, because to do otherwise would have been not merely bold but incomprehensible to her peers. The brownstone interiors reflected this same logic of concealment and revelation. Behind those austere facades of limestone and dark brick, there existed spaces of almost voluptuous comfort. Libraries with leather-bound volumes that had been acquired for their aesthetic rather than their utility. Drawing rooms with upholstered furniture in jewel tones that would fade slowly in the gaslight, creating an effect of deliberate impermanence. Dining rooms with tables that could stretch to accommodate 50 guests, yet with dimensions so precisely calculated that conversation would flow in the correct direction, toward the heads of the table where power naturally pooled. The streets themselves had become a kind of social geography. Fifth Avenue north of 34th Street was becoming the neighborhood of the truly great families. Madison Avenue, just one block east, occupied a curious middle ground, still respectable, still desirable, yet somehow understood to be marginally less consequential. This was not a question of actual wealth, for some Madison Avenue residents possessed fortunes equal to those of their Fifth Avenue neighbors. It was purely a matter of chronology and precedent, the weight of who had lived where first. And yet this entire social apparatus was relatively new, still being invented even as it operated. The grandmothers of these Gilded Age matriarchs had lived in a New York that was far more casual, far more mercantile, far less concerned with the invisible rules that now governed every social moment. The transition had occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly, driven by the tremendous wealth generated in the decades following the Civil War. As fortunes multiplied, and as the industrial magnates and railroad barons accumulated their incomprehensible sums, the need arose for a system that could distinguish between the merely wealthy and the truly significant, between the new money and the old, between those who belonged and those who, no matter their financial position, remained forever outside. In this moment of New York's development, the Astors were neither newcomers nor established ancients. They occupied a peculiar middle ground that was nonetheless the most privileged position available. Their wealth was old enough to carry weight, but not so ancient as to be considered genuinely historical. They were wealthy enough to shape taste, but not so overwhelming in their power that they drew resentment. And they lived within the city itself, unlike some magnates who maintained their principal residences elsewhere, which meant they were present and visible, and therefore able to influence, day by day, the infinitesimal adjustments that kept this social system in balance. One might pause here to consider what it meant to be part of creating a system that would, in time, become almost completely rigid. The Astors and their peers were in effect constructing a cage of social convention, and then locking themselves within it, not realizing, perhaps, that the bars were being welded with each new ball, each new restrictive rule about who might marry whom, each new assertion of exclusivity. The ballrooms, the brownstones, the careful arrangements of furniture and people, all of it was theatre, and very good theatre at that. But theatre, by definition, is a performance, a carefully constructed artifice designed to give the appearance of naturalness. The invisible rules of old New York society worked precisely because almost no one acknowledged that they were rules at all. They simply felt like the natural order of things, the way the world was arranged. And that sensation of inevitability, of course, was the truest mark of their power. The Astors had become not merely wealthy, but woven into the very fabric of how society understood itself. There was a woman in New York, in the latter half of the 19th century, whose name became synonymous with something far more intangible than real estate or fur, something more difficult to measure or map on any surveyor's chart. She was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, though the city knew her simply as the Mrs. Astor, a title that carried within it an almost ecclesiastical weight. a sense that she alone held dominion over a kingdom made of silk and decorum, and the careful geometry of who was permitted to know whom. She did not build buildings as her husband's family had done, though their mansions rose around her. She did not trade in commodities. Instead, she traded in something rarer and more durable: legitimacy, the invisible currency of belonging. The Schermerhorn name itself carried Old Dutch weight, one of those families whose ancestry reached back to the founding of New Amsterdam, to a time when the very concept of New York's elite had been less about money than about the quiet certainty of bloodlines. When Caroline married William Backhouse Astor Jr., a distant cousin of the family's original mercantile genius, she brought with her not just a respectable fortune, but a kind of social permission, a passport into the oldest circles of New York society. Yet even this was not enough for her. Somehow, she intuited something about the nature of power in a rapidly changing city, something that her husband, content with his real estate portfolios and his horses, perhaps did not grasp as clearly. New York in the 1870s and 1880s was becoming something unprecedented in America. The wealth flowing into the city had transformed it from a prosperous port into something approaching a new Rome, a place where fortunes vast beyond comprehension were accumulating in the hands of railway barons and industrial magnates and financial speculators. But this created a problem, one that Caroline understood with almost crystalline clarity. If everyone with money could simply purchase their way into society, then wealth meant nothing, because wealth alone was no longer scarce. What became scarce, what became truly valuable, was exclusion. It was the ability to say no. It was knowing who did not belong. Caroline began her revolution, if one could call it that, by understanding something fundamental about human nature. People do not truly want access to everything. What they want, what they crave with almost desperate intensity, is access to what is difficult to obtain. If a ballroom could accommodate 500 guests, those 500 would never believe themselves special. But if only 400 were invited, if an invitation to Mrs. Astor's ball became something that required not just money, but the correct ancestry, the correct deportment, the correct friends, then an invitation became a kind of social currency more precious than gilt-edged bonds. The famous 400 emerged from this logic, from her logic, a number she reportedly arrived at partly by counting the capacity of her largest ballroom, partly by a kind of aristocratic intuition about what constituted manageable exclusivity. These 400 represented the true elite of New York society according to her standards, the families worth knowing, the people who would be invited to her balls and her dinners, the households from which suitable marriages might be contracted. Everyone else, no matter how wealthy, no matter how successful their business ventures might be, remained outside looking in, like spectators at a window. What made this system so ingenious, so durable, was that it did not merely reflect wealth or power. It created a social mythology that transcended mere economics. A family that was not on the 400 list was wealthy, but somehow not quite respectable. A businessman who had amassed a tremendous fortune found that this accomplishment meant nothing if Caroline Schermerhorn Astor did not deem him suitable company. Money, which had always been America's great democratizer, suddenly had a gatekeeper, and that gatekeeper was a woman whose true power lay not in what she owned or controlled in the traditional sense, but in what she refused to share. Her influence extended far beyond her own ballroom, far beyond the guest lists of her private entertainments. She became a kind of arbiter, not just of fashion, but of morality, or at least the appearance of morality. The standards she set for behavior, for dress, for the acceptable ways that one spoke and moved and conducted oneself, these became the standards by which all of New York society was measured. A widow who remarried too quickly fell from favor. A man who engaged in certain kinds of business dealings, no matter how profitable, might find himself suddenly excluded from invitations. The 400 was not merely a list, it was a code of conduct, a shared understanding of how one was supposed to behave if one wished to remain in good standing. What is fascinating, what perhaps explains why this system endured for so long despite its obvious arbitrariness, is that even those who resented Caroline's authority, even those who chafed against her rules and sought to find ways around them, nonetheless desired her approval. There was something in the human spirit that craved validation from authority, especially authority that seemed both absolute and yet somehow deserved, earned through lineage and taste, and an almost invisible superiority of character. She had created not just a hierarchy but a mythology, one in which being invited meant being chosen meant being worthy, and being worthy meant being truly American in the deepest sense. The ballrooms in which she held court were themselves temples to this new social order. They were designed with an almost religious attention to detail, with chandeliers that cast warm light over ballroom floors arranged for the particular geometries of social interaction. The music that played during her dances, the food that was served, the flowers that decorated the tables, all of these elements were carefully curated to communicate a message about refinement, about the possession of something more than mere wealth. These were the spaces in which American aristocracy performed itself into existence, in which the fiction of a hereditary elite built on something other than money was enacted over and over again until it began to feel like truth. And perhaps it was truth, or at least a kind of truth, because what Caroline understood, what she managed to articulate through the silent language of invitations and guest lists, was that any society requires hierarchy. The question was not whether there would be those inside and those outside, the chosen and the unchosen, but rather who would determine those categories. She had placed herself in the position of judge, and in doing so, she had created something that would outlast her own lifetime, something that would shape the texture of American social life for generations to come, a belief in the existence of refinement, in the possibility of true distinction, in a world where some people, by birth or by grace, simply belonged more than others. In her later years, ensconced in her mansion on Fifth Avenue, surrounded by furnishings and paintings and the accumulated artifacts of her station, Caroline could reflect on what she had built. It was not a fortune, though she possessed one. It was not a company or an industry or a product that could be measured in its usefulness. Instead, she had built a system, an invisible architecture of social meaning, one that transformed the raw fact of wealth into something more refined, more durable, more like what people had always imagined when they thought about aristocracy. She had made New York society into a kind of work of art, and she had made herself its permanent curator. But beneath the glittering surfaces of Caroline's carefully ordered salons, another current was moving through the family, quieter than the social pageantry, but no less powerful. It was the current of rivalry, the kind that builds not in anger, but in the slow accretion of slights and diverging visions about what the Astor name should mean. And at the center of this quiet conflict stood two men whose relationship would reshape the very landscape of Manhattan itself. William Waldorf Astor was the elder cousin, the son of William Backhouse Astor Jr., and he carried within him a particular kind of restlessness. While his relatives seemed content to sit upon their inherited wealth, like dragons upon gold, William Waldorf possessed a mind that wanted to do something, to build, to create, to leave a mark that was unmistakably his own, rather than merely the custodianship of his father's careful accumulations. He had been educated abroad, he spoke multiple languages, and he harbored what some might call artistic pretensions, or what others might call a genuine intellectual hunger that the narrow confines of inherited American society seemed ill-equipped to satisfy. Caroline's son, meanwhile, was William Astor IV, though he was often called by his middle name, Waldorf. which created a certain confusion in family registers and newspaper columns that would have amused anyone paying attention. He stood to inherit not just wealth, but also something far more precious in the eyes of his mother, the position of patriarch of the most exclusive social circle in America. The weight of Caroline's legacy, her invention of the 400, her absolute dominion over who was in and who was out. All of this was meant to pass to him. He was the chosen heir not just to money, but to social authority itself. What happened between them was partly about money, yes, but it was also about something deeper. It was about what one's inheritance actually meant. Did it mean the right to rest upon the accomplishments of the past? Or did it mean the obligation to expand, to build, to ensure that the family name would be spoken not just with respect for what had been accumulated, but with genuine awe for what might be created? Around the year 1885, William Waldorf Astor made a move that would reverberate through family dinners and society papers for decades to come. He owned a substantial parcel of land on Fifth Avenue at 34th Street, and on that land stood his cousin Caroline's house, the great mansion that had served as the unofficial center of her social empire. The two properties were adjacent, and the relationship between them had been cordial, which is to say, it had been carefully maintained through the kind of restraint that wealthy relations practice when proximity forces civility. But William Waldorf, looking at the aging mansion, looking at his own ambitions, and perhaps looking at a certain calculation about his cousin's mortality and what might come after, began to envision something entirely different for his portion of Fifth Avenue. He began to dream of a hotel, not just any hotel, but a grand establishment, modern, innovative, and bearing his name, a structure that would stand as a monument, not to inherited wealth, but to entrepreneurial vision, to the idea that an Astor could still make things rather than merely own them. Caroline, now in her late 70s and still the undisputed arbiter of New York society, was not pleased. The thought of a hotel, that most commercial of enterprises, rising where her own home stood and rising under the Astor name, struck her as a kind of betrayal. Hotels were where transients stayed, where the socially uncertain checked in for a night. Hotels were public in a way that deeply offended her sensibility. The Astor name belonged in drawing rooms, not on marquees. But William Waldorf pressed forward. He designed the hotel with meticulous care, hired the finest architects, and began construction. The Waldorf Hotel, as it came to be called, opened in 1893, and it was a revelation. 13 stories tall, when that height still commanded genuine astonishment, with electric lights, steam heat, and elevators that seemed to transport guests upward with the smoothness of levitation. It was, to put it simply, magnificent, and it was unapologetically commercial and modern, and bearing the full weight of the Astor name. Did this provoke a response from Caroline's side of the family? Perhaps we might say it encouraged one. Young William, Caroline's son, found himself in a peculiar position. His mother's house still stood adjacent to this hotel, increasingly diminished in appearance by comparison, increasingly surrounded by the commercial bustle that the hotel inevitably generated. One can imagine the quiet conversations, the suggestions, the gentle but firm pushing from his mother toward a particular course of action. And so it came to pass that William, Caroline's heir, made his own announcement. He would build a hotel of his own, not across the street, not somewhere distant, but right there, immediately adjacent to his cousin's structure. The Astoria Hotel, it would be called, and it would be different, grander, more refined. Where the Waldorf represented the new commercial aesthetic, the Astoria would represent something more dignified, more aligned with the old money sensibilities that Caroline had spent her lifetime codifying. The construction was swift, and the competition between the two buildings became the talk of New York. Newspapers tracked the progress with the kind of interest typically reserved for matters of genuine public import. Here was the Astor family, seemingly infinite in wealth and influence, dividing against itself in the most visible and structural way possible. The buildings rose simultaneously, like twin monuments to a family schism, like brother and sister engaged in a competition that their mother had carefully orchestrated from her position of aging authority. And then, in a development that seemed almost scripted by some benevolent force, someone had the idea, one might never know precisely who suggested it first, that perhaps these two buildings could be connected. Perhaps, rather than remaining entirely separate competitors, they could be linked internally, creating a combined entity that would be greater than either could be alone. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel, as it came to be known, opened as a unified establishment, a merger that seemed to resolve the rivalry, even as it preserved the memory of it in its hyphenated name. It was a peculiar kind of victory for everyone involved. William Waldorf Astor had proven his ability to build something significant and modern. William Astor had satisfied his mother's demand that the family's commercial ventures maintain a certain dignity and exclusivity, and Caroline herself, still alive to see the completion, could observe that her family's name now presided over what was arguably the most prestigious hotel in the world, a place where the elite of New York and visitors from across the globe could stay and dine and be reminded of Astor supremacy. But there was something else happening too, something that the participants themselves perhaps did not fully recognize at the moment. The very act of building these hotels, of converting land that had been purely residential and social into something explicitly commercial, marked a subtle turning point. The Astors were no longer simply sitting upon wealth that previous generations had accumulated. They were actively engaged in the business of making more. They were becoming, in a sense, entrepreneurs as much as heirs, and the distinction between those two categories was beginning to blur in ways that would reshape not just the family, but the entire character of Manhattan itself. The hotels themselves would become legendary, institutions that would endure and transform and ultimately pass into other hands. But in those early years of the 1890s, they stood as proof that the Astor name could still command respect, not through the mere force of accumulated wealth, but through the ability to create something genuinely useful and beautiful and wanted by the world. While his cousin Caroline held court in New York's drawing rooms, another Astor was turning his gaze across the Atlantic, toward a landscape of rolling estates and ancient titles, toward a world that, however much money you possessed in Manhattan, would never quite grant you the legitimacy you sought. William Waldorf Astor had grown restless. The feud with his cousin had soured him on New York society, it is true, but there was something deeper at work, a sense that America, for all its newness and possibility, could never offer what the old world promised: the weight of history, the patina of ancestral claim, a social order not yet disrupted by the noise of new fortunes. In 1891, at the height of his wealth and influence, William Waldorf Astor made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable to his great-grandfather John Jacob. He departed New York, not as a traveler seeking respite, but as a man closing a chapter. He rented Cliveden House, a grand neoclassical estate in Buckinghamshire, just west of London, on the Thames. The mansion sat amid parkland so vast that standing in one room, you could not see the edge of the property. Servants numbered in the dozens. The gardens had been laid out by Capability Brown himself, that most revered of English landscape architects. For a moment, picture what it must have felt like to exchange the hardness of Manhattan granite for the soft curve of English lawns, to trade the vertical scramble of Fifth Avenue for horizontal stretches of private land stretching toward the horizon. Yet William Waldorf did not come to England as a visitor. He came to stay. And more than that, he came with an intention. He began to acquire. First came the country estates, Cliveden, and before long, Hever Castle in Kent, that ancient seat with walls that had known medieval knights and Tudor queens. He purchased properties as though collecting titles, as though each acquisition drew him further into the fabric of England itself. The expenditures were staggering. He spent fortunes restoring these houses, bringing in craftsmen, importing tapestries and paintings, performing the architectural equivalent of what his ancestors had done in the wilderness, claiming territory through will and wealth. By 1899, William Waldorf Astor took a step that, to many observers in New York, felt like a betrayal. He renounced his American citizenship, not in anger, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a man who had already made his choice. He became a British subject. He would become, in time, an English peer. Viscount Astor, later Baron Astor of Hever, the son of a New York millionaire, the great-great-grandson of the fur trader from Waldorf, Germany, had erased his American nationality as though it were ink on parchment, and in its place inscribed himself into an order that dated back centuries before the United States existed. This act of renunciation troubled many who heard of it. The Astor name was American, synonymous with American industry and restless acquisition. And yet, from William Waldorf's perspective, he was not abandoning anything. He was completing something. He was following a logic that had been implicit in the family's rise all along, the idea that enough money, acquired and concentrated with sufficient cunning, could eventually purchase not merely goods or properties, but legitimacy itself, the kind that could not be forged in a single generation in a new nation, but could be assumed or acquired in an ancient one. His newspaper empire back in America, he had been a patron of cultural institutions, a significant figure in Manhattan's intellectual life. All of this he largely abandoned. He divested himself. It was as though he were shedding a skin. England became not simply a place of residence, but a project of complete metamorphosis. And the fascinating thing, from this distance of more than a century, is how successful that metamorphosis was. By the early 1900s, William Waldorf Astor was no longer primarily an American businessman. He was an English lord, a collector of antiquities, a man of cultivation and quiet influence in English society. His family came with him into this new world. His son, Waldorf, would inherit not merely wealth, but this new position, this newly minted English identity that still carried within it the ghost of American fortune. The family split had now become geographical as well as social. There were Astors in New York, still powerful, still wealthy, still embedded in Manhattan's machinery. But there were also Astors in England, who saw themselves as something different, not merely rich Americans, but members of the British gentry, participants in an order that transcended nations and commerce. One wonders, in the quietness of considering this decision, what John Jacob Astor would have thought. He who had crossed the ocean as an immigrant, carrying his wares, his ambition, his outsider's hunger. His great-grandson had made the reverse journey, not out of necessity, but out of a different kind of hunger. Not for wealth, which he already possessed in abundance, but for the appearance of permanence, for the sense that one's place in society was not contingent upon markets or fortunes, but inscribed in the very foundation of the land itself. In renouncing his American citizenship, William Waldorf was making a statement about what the American dream, for all its democratic promise, could never quite deliver to those who had arrived too late to be founding families, too foreign in origin to shake off the sense of being, no matter how many generations had passed, still somehow new. In England, at least, everyone was, in a sense, new once, and if you had enough money, and enough time, and enough will, you could buy your way into the texture of ancient belonging. By the close of the 19th century, and into the early years of the 20th, the Astor name had become so woven into the architecture and social fabric of New York that it scarcely needed announcement. The fortune had passed through careful hands, had multiplied across Manhattan's streets and avenues, and had settled into a kind of immense, comfortable stability that only families of extraordinary wealth could know. Yet within this quiet accumulation, within the brownstones and the rental properties and the careful ledgers of the real estate empire, there emerged a figure who seemed almost restless with the weight of his inheritance. His name was John Jacob Astor IV, and he would become, in the twilight of his life, a man shaped less by the patient logic of his ancestors than by a kind of relentless, searching curiosity about the world and the mechanisms that moved through it. John Jacob Astor IV was born in 1864, a son of William Carl Astor, and he inherited not only the family's vast holdings, but also something less tangible and perhaps more dangerous, a mind that seemed always to be reaching, questioning, inventing. Where his forefathers had concentrated their energies on the accumulation and preservation of what they possessed, this Astor seemed drawn instead to creation, to the making of new things, to understanding how the modern world worked beneath its visible surface. He studied at Columbia College, as was fitting for a young man of his station, but his education extended far beyond the formal lecture halls. He spent his hours reading in physics and mechanics, sketching designs, conducting small experiments in the manner of the amateur scientist or the dilettante inventor, though dilettante seems a peculiar word to apply to a man who possessed both the intellect and the unlimited resources to pursue his inquiries seriously. It is worth pausing here to consider what it meant to be wealthy in Astor IV's era, and to be young enough still to believe that wealth might serve purposes beyond the mere consolidation of itself. The Gilded Age had transformed America into a landscape of stunning contradictions, where the most advanced mechanical innovations of the age were being developed and deployed, where railroads stitched together continents, where electric light was beginning to banish the darkness that had governed human existence for millennia. Into this world of possibility and progress, John Jacob Astor IV stepped with the confidence of his bloodline and the hunger of an intellect that could not rest. He became a man of patents, of designs, of theoretical contributions to the emerging technologies of his time. One of his more notable inventions concerned the design of turbines, and though the technical particulars may interest only the specialists, what matters for our purposes is that Astor took seriously the idea that he might contribute something meaningful to the advancement of human knowledge and mechanical capacity. But invention alone does not suffice to define a man, particularly not a man born into such extraordinary circumstances. Astor IV was also a collector, a builder of libraries, a patron of certain intellectual pursuits that reflected his own curiosity about the natural world. He accumulated rare books. He took an interest in navigation and meteorology. He was, in short, a man of the 19th century type, the educated gentleman amateur whose independent wealth allowed him the luxury of pursuing knowledge for its own sake, following whatever thread of inquiry might present itself. There was something almost innocent in this, something that belonged to a world that was already beginning to fade, even as he lived within it. The 20th century was arriving with its demands for specialization, for the division of knowledge into ever narrower domains, and Astor IV seemed, in his scattered enthusiasms and his wide-ranging interests, to belong to an older, more fluid intellectual world. His personal life moved through the conventional patterns expected of a man of his station, though with certain complications and ruptures. He married first and divorced, a scandal that touched even the thick-skinned Astor family, though the family's wealth and position were sufficient to weather it. Then, in 1911, at the age of 47, he married again, a young woman named Madeline Force, who was just 18 years old. The marriage caused considerable comment among the guardians of New York society, for the disparity in their ages seemed to some an unseemly thing, yet it was not uncommon among men of Astor's generation and station to seek wives from among the younger women of prominent families. Madeline was beautiful, well-connected, and from a respectable merchant family, and if the marriage seemed to many an unequal pairing, it was also arranged with the meticulous attention to dynasty and property that such unions required. By the early months of 1912, John Jacob Astor IV stood at the apex of American wealth. His fortune was estimated at somewhere between $70 and $100 million, a sum so vast that it resists easy comprehension even now, more than a century later. He owned substantial portions of Midtown Manhattan. He controlled vast real estate holdings. His income from rents alone placed him among the wealthiest individuals in the country, and possibly in the world. He was respected, if not universally loved. He was known for his collections, his inventions, his intellectual interests. He had survived scandal and social criticism. He seemed, in many ways, to have achieved everything that his family name promised, everything that his inheritance could deliver. And yet, there was something in John Jacob Astor IV that remained unsettled, that could not quite find its resting place even in such extraordinary abundance. Perhaps this is what led him, in the early spring of that year, to book passage on a ship, not merely to travel, which any wealthy man might do, but to travel in a particular way, aboard a vessel that represented the very height of modern engineering and design. The ship was the RMS Titanic, the great White Star liner that had been built over the previous 3 years in Belfast, that had been launched only weeks before, and that now stood ready for its maiden voyage across the Atlantic. It was, in its way, a ship that embodied many of the things that seemed to fascinate Astor IV: the marriage of human ingenuity and mechanical power, the assertion of control over the natural forces of the sea, the demonstration that modern civilization had transcended the limitations that had bound previous ages. Among the passengers who would board the Titanic in Southampton in April of 1912, none would carry with them the weight of such an extraordinary fortune. None would embody quite so completely the achievement and the ambition of an American mercantile dynasty. John Jacob Astor IV was, by every measure available to the society of his time, the most distinguished passenger aboard. He traveled with his young wife, with their entourage, with their trunks and cases, and the comfortable apparatus of wealthy American travel. He had, in a sense, everything. And he was, as he took his place among the other first-class passengers making their way toward the ship's gangway, unaware, as we all are unaware, of what the next few days would bring, of how the mechanisms and certainties of the modern world could fail in an instant, of how even the greatest fortune and the most restless intellect could be rendered utterly powerless before the cold indifference of the sea. On the morning of April 10th, 1912, the White Star Line's newest and most celebrated vessel, the RMS Titanic, lay moored at Southampton, her black hull gleaming in the pale English light. She was, in nearly every measurable way, a triumph of human ambition and engineering, 902 feet long, displacing 46,000 tons, fitted with every known comfort and luxury that the wealthiest travelers of the world had come to expect. And among those who boarded her that day, in her most opulent cabins, was John Jacob Astor IV, at 50 years old, accompanied by his 18-year-old bride, Madeline Force Astor, pregnant with their first child. The voyage was, in its early days, nothing but ordinary pleasure and the quiet satisfaction of transcontinental travel among the world's most elevated circles. Astor had chosen to winter in Egypt, seeking respite for his young wife's health. She had suffered a minor automobile accident months before, and they were now returning to New York, with all the unhurried confidence of those for whom ocean crossings were routine occurrences. The ship's passenger list that voyage read like a ledger of the era's greatest fortunes: the Wiedeners of Philadelphia, the Astors themselves, industrialists and heirs, celebrities and rising men of commerce. The ship itself seemed almost a floating city, complete with a swimming bath, a gymnasium with electric horses, electric elevators, and restaurants serving meals that rivaled the finest hotels of Europe. Astor would have occupied his stateroom, the parlor suite C-62, with its private promenade deck, its fireplace, and its furnishings of dark oak and velvet, the kind of space that announced not mere wealth, but the very pinnacle of it. He was, by all accounts, a courteous and engaged traveler, curious about the ship's mechanical systems, the engineering that had brought it forth. He was not a man given to excessive display, though everything about him spoke of unquestionable means. Madeline, young and beautiful, was the object of considerable curiosity among the other passengers. A May-December marriage that had scandalized and fascinated society in equal measure, and they kept largely to themselves, as those of such prominence often do. The Atlantic on that crossing was cold. The water temperature had begun to drop as the Titanic moved northward into ice fields that stretched across the shipping lanes. Warnings had been received throughout the day and evening of April 14th. Messages from other vessels, transmitted by wireless operators, reporting icebergs in the ship's path. The radio operators aboard the Titanic received several such warnings, and these were dutifully, if somewhat irregularly, logged and communicated to the bridge. How much urgency accompanied these warnings, we cannot say with absolute certainty. We know only that Captain Edward Smith, commanding the vessel, chose to maintain her speed, full steam ahead, through waters that were known to be treacherous. At approximately 11:40 in the evening of April 14, 1912, the lookouts in the crow's nest spotted something ahead in the darkness, a shape that seemed to rise from the black water without warning. There was no moon. The sea was extraordinarily calm, almost glassy, a condition that made icebergs far more difficult to see against the darkness. The iceberg appeared suddenly, perhaps 500 feet away, a mass of white ice that seemed to loom without warning. A bell was rung 3 times in the crow's nest. Orders were shouted from the bridge. The Titanic's engines were reversed. Her rudder was thrown hard to starboard. But the ship was moving at approximately 22.5 knots, carrying 46,000 tons of steel and human life at tremendous velocity through still water and the darkness. Physics, it seemed, was not negotiable. The collision, when it came, was almost gentle in its initial sensation. There was no tremendous crash, no violent tremor that would have sent people tumbling from their beds. Rather, there was a grinding, a prolonged scraping along the starboard side of the hull as the iceberg, moving downward and inward beneath the waterline, tore open the ship's side across 6 compartments. To many of the passengers, to those asleep in their cabins, to those still awake in the smoking rooms and lounges, it felt more like the loss of a propeller, or perhaps a minor mechanical failure. Some passengers barely noticed. Others felt only a slight tremor, a curious vibration, the kind of sensation that raised questions but not yet alarm. John Jacob Astor was roused from sleep, as were his wife and others throughout the vessel. The crew of the Titanic, following procedures long established, began to move through the ship's corridors, waking passengers, instructing them to dress warmly and come to their boat stations. There was no sense of panic yet. The Titanic was, after all, unsinkable, or so the White Star Line had proclaimed, and the press had echoed, and the public had come to believe. The ship was divided into compartments. Even if several were breached, the vessel would surely stay afloat. Surely this was merely a precaution. Surely the ship would limp back to port, and the story would become merely an anecdote, a moment of excitement to recount at dinner parties. But Captain Smith, moving through the ship, examining the damage with the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, knew a different truth. The iceberg had opened the hull to the sea across 6 compartments. The Titanic's design allowed for flooding in up to 4 compartments and still maintain buoyancy. With 6 compromised, the mathematics were inexorable. The ship was sinking. The question now was only how much time remained. Astor, preparing himself and his wife, would have had perhaps an hour and 40 minutes before the end came. He dressed himself carefully, put on a lifebelt, and escorted Madeline to the boat deck, now beginning to fill with passengers in various states of confusion and realization. The night was remarkably cold, the air utterly still. Above them, the stars burned with exceptional clarity, the same stars that had guided mariners for millennia, now witnesses to a modern catastrophe. The lifeboats, as we now know, were inadequate in number. There were only 20 boats aboard, capable of carrying roughly 1,178 people. The Titanic carried approximately 2,224 passengers and crew. The mathematics of survival were as clear as the mathematics of flooding. Women and children first, the order went out. Madeline, young and expecting, was helped into Collapsible Sea, one of the Titanic's boats. Astor, following the customs of the age and the explicit orders of the officers directing the evacuation, remained behind. He did not resist. He did not storm the boats or attempt to override the protocols of the disaster. Instead, he moved back into the ship, back into the warmth and the light, as the cold water rose inexorably through the corridors below. The final hour of the Titanic was a slow crescendo of horror, a gradual tilting of the ship as the bow sank deeper and the stern rose higher, the angle of the decks becoming steeper, more absurd, more impossible. The lights burned on, fed by the engines that continued to turn even as the water climbed higher around them. And then, with a suddenness that broke the terrible slow motion of the preceding minutes, the ship's structure, weakened by the stress and strain, gave way. The Titanic broke apart between the third and fourth funnels, the bow section descending into the black water, the stern section rising nearly vertical before two, slipping beneath the surface at 2:20 in the morning of April 15, 1912. In the lifeboats, now spread across the water, those who had survived in the boats heard the sounds, the screams of those in the water, those who had gone down with the ship and were now clinging to wreckage, fighting the cold, the darkness, the profound indifference of the ocean. Madeline Astor, in her lifeboat, was spared the worst of these sounds. She had been moved to a different boat before the end. She would not learn of her husband's death until hours later, when rescue came, when the Carpathia appeared in the dawn light and gathered the survivors from their boats. The body of John Jacob Astor IV was never recovered, though some bodies were pulled from the water in the hours and days that followed. His remains, if they existed, descended into the deep, into the cold and the darkness, into the same water through which his ancestors had traveled in their merchant vessels centuries before. The richest man aboard the Titanic had been unable to purchase survival. The vastness of his fortune, the scope of his influence, the dimensions of his carefully constructed world, all of it had proven as fragile, in the end, as the hull of any ship, as subject to the laws of physics and the indifference of the sea. The ocean holds its mysteries long after the morning light has faded. In the days that followed the Titanic's sinking, as rescue ships combed the dark waters and survivors gave their accounts in hushed, shock-laden voices, the question of John Jacob Astor IV's fate remained suspended in uncertainty. He had been seen on deck in the final moments, helping his wife into Collapsible Sea, his face composed even as the bow tilted toward the abyss. Some witnesses reported he had jumped into the sea. Others said they saw him standing alone on the tilting deck, watching the ship's last convulsion. No one could say with precision what his final moments held. 4 days later, on April 18th, a body rose through the cold Atlantic. It was recovered by the CSS Mackay Bennett, a Canadian cable repair ship that had been converted into a morgue for the sea's casualties. The body was badly damaged by immersion and the force of the sinking, but personal effects made identification possible. Among the remains were articles of clothing, a gold watch, a diamond ring. It was John Jacob Astor. The wealthiest man on the Titanic would not be interred with the ceremony that wealth and prominence might ordinarily demand. His remains were brought first to Halifax, then to New York, where the shock of his death struck the city with the force of a second disaster. The American newspapers could hardly contain their anguish. Here was not merely a shipwreck, catastrophic as that was, but the death of one of the nation's most recognizable figures. The Astors, after all, had been woven so deeply into New York's fabric that their loss was felt as a wound to the city itself. Every major newspaper ran extensive coverage. The funeral, held on May 4th, drew crowds that lined the streets. Astor was buried in Trinity Church Cemetery, in a plot that his family had long reserved, among the graves of other generations of Astors stretching back nearly a century. But what struck observers most profoundly was how Astor's death reframed the family's image in the public mind. Until that April morning, the Astors had been, to most Americans, symbols of almost untouchable wealth and privilege, distant, their lives unfolding in a realm separate from ordinary experience. The family had seemed to exist in a kind of permanent remove from tragedy, from the vulnerabilities that touched everyone else. Money surely would protect them. Influence would shield them. Station would insulate them from the common sorrows of mortality. The Titanic took that mythology and submerged it beneath the Atlantic. The tragedy, in a way that nothing before it had managed, made the Astor name synonymous not with invulnerability, but with loss. John Jacob Astor IV had possessed the greatest fortune that American commerce could accumulate, and yet the sea had claimed him as readily as it had claimed 1,000 unnamed passengers. The gold in his pockets could not buy him air. His inventions could not save him. His wife, pregnant, young, bewildered, had survived without him. The newspapers dwelt on this with an almost voyeuristic intensity. The richest man in America, they noted again and again, could not escape the same fate that awaited every soul aboard that ship. There was something in the public imagination that shifted after this. The Astor family, previously somewhat insulated from broad public sentiment, suddenly became objects of sympathetic interest. Newspapers that had once chronicled their parties and their scandals with a tone of distant mockery now covered them with a more measured gravity. The widow, Madeleine Astor, became a figure of fascination. A young woman left with an enormous fortune, a child born after her husband's death, and the difficult task of managing the legacy of a man who had not lived to see his son. In the months and years following the sinking, the Astors found themselves at the center of America's collective processing of that tragedy. Congressional hearings were held. Questions were asked about the ship's insufficiency, about the protocols that had failed, about the social hierarchies that had determined who lived and who died in the lifeboats. The hearings, which took place in the United States Senate, inevitably drew the Astor family into public examination. Madeleine gave testimony. The family's lawyers fielded questions. All of this unfolded before a nation that suddenly felt a peculiar investment in the Astor story. The recovery of Astor's body itself became a moment of symbolic weight. That he had been found, identified, brought back. There was something almost ritualistic in the way the newspapers covered this. The body, which had been one of many in the sea, was retrieved and given a name, a history, a place in the nation's consciousness. The newspapers printed descriptions of his burial. They noted the flowers. They recorded the names of the prominent New Yorkers who attended. It was as though the family was being called upon to grieve not in private, but before the eyes of the nation. What emerged from this period was a subtle but significant shift in how the Astor family was perceived. They were no longer quite the untouchable plutocrats of previous decades. They had, through Astor IV's death, been brought into the realm of human mortality in a way that resonated across class lines. The Titanic tragedy created, paradoxically, a kind of strange intimacy between the Astors and the broader American public. People who had never met John Jacob Astor IV felt they knew something of his final moments. Families who would never possess a fraction of his wealth found themselves considering what they might have done in those final hours on the tilting deck. The family itself was changed by this experience. Madeline would remarry and divorce twice more before the end of her life, living a long existence in which the identity of the widow of John Jacob Astor IV seemed to define her public presence. The fortune that Astor IV left behind, an enormous sum, even by Gilded Age standards, now carried with it the weight of tragedy. The money could not have saved him. It had not protected him. What it had done instead was extend his name into history, had made his death more widely known, more widely mourned than the deaths of the thousands of others who perished with him. And so the Astor name, which had been built through the quiet accumulation of wealth and land, through careful marriages and the slow consolidation of influence, was now also defined by loss. The empire that John Jacob Astor had begun, that his son had expanded, that had come to seem almost infinite in its reach and durability, had been revealed as contingent upon something fragile, the life of a single man in the Atlantic darkness. The Titanic became, for the Astor family, a kind of turning point. The age of their absolute dominance was beginning to wane, though few could have recognized it at the time. What remained to be seen was how the surviving members of the family would navigate the years ahead, how they would adapt to a world that had suddenly made them symbols not of achievement, but of tragedy, not of power, but of loss. Across the Atlantic, in the quieter drawing rooms of London and the countryside estates of Berkshire and Devon, a different branch of the Astor tree was taking root. While the American Astors navigated the aftermath of John Jacob Astor IV's death and the shifting landscape of Manhattan fortunes, William Waldorf Astor had already made his choice to leave America behind. He had renounced his citizenship in 1899 and settled himself in England, purchasing a vast medieval estate called Cliveden and establishing himself as something closer to an English country gentleman than a Manhattan landlord. The very act of stepping away, of turning his back on the continent that had made his family wealthy, was itself a kind of statement. But what could it have meant, really, to abandon such roots? The answer, if we listen carefully to what followed, might be that William Waldorf Astor was not abandoning wealth at all. He was translating it. He became a British subject, then a baronet, then eventually a viscount. He collected art and antiquities with the appetite of a man assembling a legacy. He wore his adopted citizenship like a carefully tailored waistcoat, and gradually, the American Astor name began to blur into something that sounded almost British when spoken aloud in certain drawing rooms. His son Waldorf Astor III inherited not just land and money, but this curious dual identity, rooted in American capital, yet shaped entirely by English sensibility and English ambition. But it was Waldorf Astor's marriage to Nancy Witcher Langhorne that would write the most remarkable chapter in the British branch's story. Nancy was American too, born in Virginia, the daughter of a tobacco trader, a woman who had grown up without the particular weight of established fortune. She was quick-witted, irreverent in ways that English society found both shocking and magnetic, and she possessed a quality that wealth alone could never purchase, a genuine, almost fearless belief in her own right to speak. When she married Waldorf Astor in 1906, she stepped into one of England's most storied households, and instead of fading into the background as protocol might have suggested, she seemed to expand. The great estate at Cliveden became something of a salon, a gathering place where political figures and artists and thinkers moved through candle-lit rooms as if on a gentle tide. Nancy Astor wanted more, though. She wanted power, and not merely the power of influence that society matrons wielded from behind champagne glasses and flower arrangements. In 1919, when her husband was elevated to the House of Lords and his seat in Parliament became vacant, Nancy stood for election to fill it. She ran as a Conservative candidate in Plymouth, and she won. At 41 years old, she became the first woman to take a seat in the British Parliament. not as a token or an experiment, but as an elected representative who fully intended to do the work. The historical record tends to soften here, loses some of its certainty. What we know is that Nancy Astor spoke often on matters of temperance, housing, and the welfare of children. What we also know is that she made enemies, powerful ones, who whispered that she was too American, too loud, too willing to cross into territory that tradition had marked as off-limits to her gender. Some accounts suggest she was a wit of considerable sharpness, others hint at ruthlessness. Did she align herself with certain political movements that history would later view with discomfort? The archival fog makes it difficult to say with the clarity we might wish. What remains undeniable is that she occupied that seat, that she voted, that she spoke when most women of her era could not, and that her presence in Parliament was itself a kind of violence against the old order. Back in America, the country Waldorf had left behind was consolidating its own Gilded Age hierarchy. But the American Astors, the direct descendants of John Jacob, found themselves increasingly bound by inheritance taxes and the slow wearing away of the absolute certainties that had defined their parents' generation. Meanwhile, in England, the British branch, secure in their titles, their estates, their position within an older and perhaps more resilient aristocracy, seemed almost insulated from the economic tremors that would come to shake the American fortune. Cliveden itself became something of a legend in the 1920s and 1930s. Political currents ran through its rooms like underground streams. Guests came and went. Nancy Astor remained controversial, unapologetic, a woman who had claimed a voice in the machinery of power and refused to surrender it, even when, perhaps especially when, the cost of her opinions became clear. She had taken the Astor name, which in America had always meant something accumulated and held, and in England she had made it mean something active, something spoken, something that moved through rooms and changed the temperature of conversations. The contrast is striking, is it not? The American Astors had become landlords and collectors, guardians of wealth that seemed almost static in its overwhelming solidity. The British Astors had become something else, participants in a narrative that was being written in real time, figures in a drama that included political conviction and personal ambition and the peculiar power that comes from occupying a space where few of your kind had stood before. And yet both branches were still, in the deepest sense, Astors, still bound by the accumulation that had begun 3 generations earlier, still shaped by the assumption that they ought to matter, that the world ought to lean in and listen when they spoke. The Astor fortune that had seemed so immutable, so woven into the very bedrock of New York and London, began to meet something that no amount of Manhattan real estate or British titles could hold back. Time, yes, but more precisely, the 20th century itself, a force that moved in ways quite different from the patient accumulation that had built empires in the previous age. The family that had grown accustomed to the idea that their wealth would compound and deepen across generations found themselves, rather suddenly, in a world where the arithmetic of money had fundamentally changed. In the opening decades of that new century, the erosion began almost invisibly. The income tax, that innovation which America had only recently embraced after the passage of the 16th Amendment in 1913, seemed at first a minor inconvenience to fortunes as vast as the Astors. A tax on income, on the earnings of their estates and investments, seemed manageable. But what no one quite appreciated, or what the Astors themselves were slow to understand, was how this new form of taxation would compound across decades. Where taxes had once been negligible, they became substantial. Where they became substantial, they began to claim larger and larger portions of annual wealth accumulation. And where that happened, the rate at which dynastic fortunes could grow began to slow, then plateau, then, in real terms, to shrink. Consider the mathematics quietly enough for a moment. A family that had spent a century buying the most valuable land in New York, at prices that now seem almost dreamlike, had built their base on scarcity and patience. But the income tax meant that money which might once have been reinvested in land acquisition was now devoted to the government. Not all of it, certainly, but enough. Over 10 years, over 30 years, over a century, the compound difference was vast. A fortune that might have doubled in 60 years, given the Astors' remarkable eye for property value, now might merely grow by half. The mathematics of empire, gentle as they sound when spoken of in terms of hundreds of thousands of acres, became increasingly unforgiving. And then came the wars. The First World War was, in many ways, a distant thing for American fortunes, certainly compared to the devastation it wreaked across the Atlantic. Yet even at a distance, it altered the landscape of wealth. The American economy shifted into an industrial mobilization unlike anything the country had seen before. Resources were redirected. Inflation began to creep into the system. The post-war boom of the 1920s seemed at first to confirm that American wealth was boundless, but the structure of that prosperity was built on something fragile: speculation, credit, the assumption that the market would continue upward without pause. When that assumption proved terribly wrong in 1929, the Astors, for all their legendary caution and conservative stewardship, could not entirely escape the reckoning. The Great Depression was, in its way, the first truly democratic disaster to strike American fortunes. Wealth had always been vulnerable to individual decisions, to bankruptcy, to scandal, to the sudden death of an heir, but a depression touched everything. It touched land values, which fell sharply. It touched rental income, which dried up as tenants could no longer pay. It touched the assumption itself that wealth was permanent. What had seemed like bedrock revealed itself to have currents running beneath. The Astors weathered it better than most. Their real estate holdings meant that even as values fell, they still held the physical assets. But the mythology of invulnerability began, ever so slightly, to crack. Then came the Second World War, and with it, a transformation in tax policy that would prove far more consequential than the income tax had been. The estate tax, or what some called the death tax, had existed before, but the war years saw it rise to confiscatory levels. A fortune passed from one generation to the next would now face taxation at 50%, then 70%, and in some proposals even higher. The mechanism was clear enough. The government needed money for war, and the wealthy held the deepest pockets. But the consequence was more subtle. It meant that it became nearly impossible, through any imaginable financial planning, to pass an intact fortune to the next generation. The great inheritances would, by law, be split between the family and the state. Picture, if you will, an Astor heir in, say, 1940, inheriting $100 million, that most magnificent of sums. The estate taxes alone would claim more than half of it before a single dollar reached the heir's hands. The remaining sum, while still extraordinary by any ordinary measure, would be insufficient to maintain the same scale of operations, the same ambitious real estate acquisitions, the same casual investment in grand projects. And when that heir died, the same process would repeat, reducing the fortune further. It was arithmetic with teeth in it, the slow mathematics of dissolution. Beyond taxes lay something more diffuse but equally consequential: the changing nature of what wealth meant and could do. The Astors had built their empire in an era when a private citizen could essentially do as he pleased with land and money. John Jacob Astor had created his company, bought his properties, held his power, all with minimal regulatory interference. By the mid-20th century, that freedom had evaporated. There were labor laws, housing codes, safety regulations, environmental restrictions. Building a grand hotel required navigating bureaucracies that would have astonished the original John Jacob. Amassing land in a city required contending with zoning boards and historical societies and neighborhood associations. Wealth remained, yes, but its ability to act unilaterally had been circumscribed. The post-war boom of the 1950s and 1960s seemed, on the surface, to suggest that the Astors would merely adapt and continue. But this was the era in which the very nature of American economic power was shifting. Where once old money and family fortunes had dominated the landscape, now new fortunes were being made in entirely different sectors: in technology, in pharmaceuticals, in entertainment, in aviation. These new fortunes lacked the ballast of physical property, but they also lacked the burden of trying to maintain vast estates and accumulated obligations to tenants and communities. They were, in a sense, more modern, more mobile, and harder to tax, at least in the early decades. The Vietnam War years saw further erosion of the idea that great family dynasties were inevitable features of American life. The Astors were hardly the face of that war, but they inhabited a world that was increasingly skeptical of inherited power and inherited wealth. The culture was shifting. The notion that money should compound across generations, that dynasties should be permanent fixtures, began to seem less obviously true. And with that cultural shift came practical consequences. Younger Astors began to fragment, some pursuing careers rather than merely stewarding estates, some donating substantial portions of their fortunes to charitable causes, some moving away from New York, the font and foundation of their power. By the 1970s and 1980s, the great consolidated Astor fortune was no longer a unified thing. It had been divided among countless heirs, each receiving a portion of the original whole. This was not financially catastrophic. Even a small portion of the Astor billions was more than sufficient to live in grand style. But it meant that no single Astor could wield the concentrated power that had once been wielded by John Jacob or even by William Backhouse Astor Sr. The heirs had become, in a sense, custodians of fragments of a former empire, each fragment still substantial, but none commanding the kind of unified force that had once shaped the development of entire cities. The Astor real estate holdings, which had been the foundation of the fortune, faced their own particular erosion. In Manhattan, properties that had been worth millions when acquired for thousands were now subject to tax assessments that reflected their true value. The annual carrying costs of maintaining vast estates became substantial. Some properties were sold, always reluctantly, always at prices that seemed inadequate compared to the inflation-adjusted original investment. Other properties were donated to charitable trusts or converted to museums, partly out of genuine cultural concern, but also as a means of reducing tax burdens. The concrete reality of vast land holdings, which had been an advantage in the 19th century, became increasingly burdensome in the 20th. And then there were the wars of attrition that families wage against themselves, divorces, estrangements, the simple human tendency for some heirs to prove far better stewards than others. One branch of the family might invest wisely and grow its portion, another might dissipate it through poor decisions or generous living. These internal dynamics, which had always existed but had been less visible when the overall fortune was so vast that even wasteful heirs could not meaningfully diminish it, now became more consequential. The fortune had become large enough that it needed managing, but no longer so enormous that management failures were invisible. The final quarter of the 20th century saw the Astor name largely disappear from the realm of active commerce and wealth accumulation. The family still owned properties, still received revenues, still wielded influence in certain circles. But they were no longer builders of new empires, no longer the people whose decisions shaped whole neighborhoods or industries. They had become, instead, stewards of history, custodians of buildings and trusts, living off accumulated assets rather than generating new ones. It was not poverty, never that, but it was, by the standards by which the family had measured itself, a diminishment. The question that historians might quietly pose, without judgment, is whether this erosion was inevitable or merely the result of choices made and policies enacted. Would a different tax regime have preserved dynastic wealth? Would a family that had been less generous with charitable giving have retained more? These are answerable questions only in the abstract. What remains clear is that the unstoppable force of compound taxation, inflation, and cultural change met the immovable object of a fortune accumulated in a different era, and the fortune, over time, began to move. By the threshold of the 21st century, the Astor story had become something quite different from what it had been. It was no longer primarily a story of accumulation and growth, of empire expanding and consolidating. It had become, instead, a story of preservation and adaptation, of a family learning how to exist in a world where inherited wealth was no longer automatically permanent, and where the patterns of a century and a half could not simply be extended into the future. And in that transformation, the Astors became, in some ways, a mirror of the broader American experience, the slow, quiet discovery that even the mightiest fortunes are subject to time and change, and that no empire, no matter how carefully built or how vast it becomes, can truly last forever unchanged. What remains of the Astor Empire, in the slow unwinding of the 21st century, is less a presence than an echo, a kind of architectural and philanthropic residue that whispers of what once was, without demanding attention. The Waldorf Astoria still stands, of course, though no longer in Astor hands. The great hotel on Fifth Avenue, that monument to cousin rivalry and Gilded Age ambition, changed ownership many times over the decades. It was sold, renovated, sold again. In 2017, it ceased to operate as a hotel altogether, transformed into residential apartments, a quieter fate than its gilded origins might have suggested. The building endures, the name endures, but the family who built it to compete with one another has long since stepped away from its daily business. The Astor name appears today most often on buildings they no longer own, in plaques that mark their historical significance. The Astor Place in Manhattan, the Astor Library Reading Room, now part of the New York Public Library, still bears the family name. These are monuments to a kind of patronage that feels almost quaint now, when great fortunes move through venture capital and derivatives rather than through the patient accumulation of brick and land. Yet, there is something persistent about how these buildings hold their names. They will likely carry the Astor mark for generations to come, long after the family itself has become merely a detail in the building's histories. The family's wealth, that vast fortune that once seemed as immovable as the Hudson River itself, dispersed through taxation, through the accidents of inheritance, through the simple mathematics of generational division. By the mid-20th century, the Astor fortune, while still substantial, was no longer the dominating force in American finance that it had been. The men and women who inherited it were, in many cases, more focused on preserving what they had than on building something new. There is a particular exhaustion that comes to old money, a kind of genteel fatigue. Yet the family did not vanish entirely. They adapted, as all families do. The Astor Foundation, established by various family members at various times, continued to make quiet grants to hospitals, to libraries, to cultural institutions. These are not the splashy philanthropic gestures of new wealth, the naming rights and the wing dedications that come with contemporary billionaires. Instead, they are slow, steady contributions to the fabric of institutions that have endured almost as long as the family itself. A library renovation, a scholarship program, the steady, unremarkable work of stewardship. In England, the Astor line that William Waldorf had transplanted grew in subtle prominence. Waldorf Astor himself, who had renounced his American citizenship with such dramatic finality, became deeply embedded in British public life. He and his wife Nancy helped define what it meant to be an American transplant in the English upper classes, and they did it with a kind of grace that suggested they had always belonged there. Their country house, Cliveden, became a centre of political and social influence. But Cliveden too has changed hands, passed to the National Trust, now open to the public on certain days. The family's private sanctuary became a museum to their own history. Nancy Astor's legacy has perhaps proven more durable than her husband's. She remains a figure of genuine historical interest, the first woman to sit in Parliament, the woman who dared to speak in that old chamber when the very idea of a woman's voice there seemed like an affront to tradition itself. But even her life is now mostly consumed by history books, by the slow accumulation of distance that turns the vivid and contentious into the safely retrospective. The Astor descendants who remain in America tend toward a kind of deliberate invisibility. They are rarely in the gossip columns. They do not grace magazine covers. The very wealthiest among them guard their privacy with the kind of quiet intensity that suggests they have learned, perhaps from the example of their ancestors, that being known can be exhausting. There are Astors still, scattered across the country, managing trusts and charitable foundations, maintaining country houses, living lives of genuine comfort and genuine obscurity. This is perhaps the ultimate victory of American money, or perhaps its ultimate fate, the ability to disappear entirely into the background of ordinary life, even while surrounded by extraordinary wealth. The Astor name itself has become something of a historical artifact. When people encounter it, they think first of the Titanic, of John Jacob Astor IV going down with the ship, an image so powerful and so perfectly symbolic that it has largely consumed the rest of the family's narrative. They think of the hotel, if they think of New York at all. They think, perhaps, of a kind of historical grandeur, of an America that is gone, an age of fortunes built on furs and land and the patient accumulation of real estate. But they do not think of the Astors as a present force in American life. That age has passed. And yet, in a very particular way, the Astors remain present in the physical fabric of the nation they helped build. When you walk past the Astor Place, when you enter the reading room of the New York Public Library, when you see their name on a building that has survived 100 years of urban transformation, you are encountering a kind of slow permanence. The buildings outlast the fortune. The institutions outlast the family's active management. What endures is not the power, but the mark, the subtle imprint left by people who understood, in their own particular way, that some things could be built to last beyond the individual. The question of what it means to be the heir of such a legacy, to carry a name that once meant something quite specific and powerful, to live in the shadow of fortunes built by your ancestors, and now steadily declining through the ordinary processes of time and taxation and generational dispersal. This is perhaps the unspoken reality of the modern Astor. They are rich, certainly. Many of them are quite comfortable, but they are no longer, in any meaningful sense, the Astors of another age. They are, instead, people who live with the knowledge that their family once mattered greatly, and that this mattering is something that cannot be fully transmitted to the next generation. Each inheritance brings a kind of loss, even as it brings material comfort. The fur trade is long gone, of course. The trading posts have become state parks or historical sites. The wilderness that John Jacob Astor once sought to dominate has reclaimed itself. Astoria, that lonely outpost on the Columbia River, is now a quiet town of 3,000 people, famous primarily for being where the Astoria column stands, a tall monument spiraling upward with the figures of the region's history carved into its surface. The Astor name is there, certainly, but it shares the column with Lewis and Clark, with trappers and with native peoples, with the slow story of westward expansion in all its complexity. It is no longer the story of the Astors alone. The Hudson River at night carries a different silence than it did 300 years ago. The water still moves with the same patient rhythm, the same darkened surface that once reflected lanterns hung from sailing vessels and the faces of men counting pelts by firelight. But the ships have changed, the cargo has changed, and the empire that rose from the patient accumulation of small dealings, furs bundled and traded, land parcels slowly assembled into neighborhoods and then into wealth itself, has dissolved like mist over the morning water, leaving behind only the faintest outline of what it was. Consider the arc of it all, if you will. A butcher's son in a small German town, possessing nothing but hunger and the conviction that distance could be crossed, that value could be created not through inheritance, but through motion and attention. John Jacob Astor moved through the world with the understanding that empires are built in increments, that you do not seize a fortune all at once, but rather collect it piece by piece, the way a river collects tributaries. A beaver pelt traded here, a musical instrument sold there, land purchased in what others saw as swampy marshland, but what his eye recognized as future. The genius was not in seeing something others could not see, perhaps, but in waiting longer than others were willing to wait, in holding ground when others sold, in understanding that time itself could be an asset if one had the patience to let it work. What remains of that empire now? The great fur trading networks that extended from the Columbia River to the Rocky Mountains, that touched the lives of thousands of trappers and native peoples in ways both transformative and devastating. Those networks have vanished as completely as the animals themselves. The wilderness routes are roads now, or they are forgotten altogether. The trading posts have become small towns with plaques commemorating what was, and yet the logic that built them still persists somewhere in the architecture of the city, in the fact that certain blocks of Manhattan real estate bear the weight of those early transactions, that buildings stand on foundations purchased with the patience of a man who understood that land, unlike furs, does not run out or lose its worth. The family fractured, as families do. The cousins who loved each other enough to build hotels side by side became the cousins who could not occupy the same room. The matriarch who created an entire social taxonomy, who decided who was and was not among the 400, who wielded acceptance as a form of power that money alone could never buy. She aged, as all people age, and her authority eventually passed to others or faded entirely into the accumulated dust of etiquette books and old newspaper clippings. The English branch of the family found new prominence, new political voice, new purpose. Yet slowly that too dimmed across the decades of 2 world wars and fundamental shifts in what power meant and where it lived. And then there was the Titanic, that extraordinary moment when the inexorable logic of wealth and certainty collided with the indifference of the ocean. John Jacob Astor IV, the last of the great Astors to possess both vast fortune and the ambitions that vast fortune could still fulfill. He stood on that deck knowing he was the wealthiest man aboard, knowing that his inventions and ideas still held possibility, and then he knew nothing at all. The ship went down. The water that had once enriched his family took him, and in taking him, it took something from the family's narrative, some sense of mastery over circumstance, some confidence that power and preparation could shield you from the basic facts of existence. What does an empire become when the things that built it no longer exist? The beaver is nearly extinct, but not quite. The wilderness has been mapped and settled and subdivided. The real estate remains, but property itself has transformed into something abstract, divided among trusts and foundations, preserved more through institutional inertia than through any active hand. The name persists in building facades, and in the casual reference of old New Yorkers to a way of life that few actually experience anymore. Streets that bear the Astor name run through neighborhoods the Astors would not recognize, past people who have no idea what an Astor was or why they should have mattered. There is something both poignant and inevitable in this fading. Empires appear to last forever when you are living in them. The fur trade seemed as permanent as the forest. The real estate seemed as stable as stone. The social hierarchy that Caroline Astor constructed seemed like an eternal law of nature, something that could not possibly collapse any more than the sun could fail to rise. Yet empires are made of time and attention and circumstance, and when those elements shift, even the grandest of them grows quiet. The Astor family learned this lesson slowly, across generations, watching their relevance transform into memory, and then into history, and then into merely something that appears in books like this one, in voices speaking into the darkness, to listeners who exist in a world entirely different from the one they dominated. The Hudson keeps moving. It has moved through all of it, through the fur-laden canoes and the merchant ships, through the eras of clipper vessels and steamships and great liners. It has moved through the building of hotels and the emergence of the 400, through the Titanic's departure and the news of its sinking, through wars and depressions and the slow dismantling of the legal and social structures that allowed wealth to concentrate so completely in so few hands. The river was there when Astor first arrived, uncertain and ambitious, and the river will be there long after the last building bearing his name has crumbled or been renamed. It neither cares nor remembers. It simply continues, holding the city on its shores the way it has held it for millennia. Perhaps this is the truest legacy of the Astor Empire, not the buildings or the money or the names on the plaques, but the reminder that empires are always temporary. They seem permanent to those within them. They feel like natural law, like the inevitable expression of wisdom and superiority, like something that will outlast generations. And yet they all fade. The most ambitious among us, the ones who move across oceans and build networks and accumulate wealth with an almost monastic dedication to the task, even they fade. Their descendants sometimes flourish, and sometimes scatter, and sometimes simply become ordinary people, living with the burden of a name that meant something once, in a world that no longer exists. In the darkness now, the river continues its motion. The city that the Astors shaped, for they did shape it, there is no denying that, their choices about where to build and what to preserve changed the fundamental character of this place. That city sleeps above the water's surface. In the morning, there will be light again, and motion, and the ordinary sounds of contemporary life. But for now, in this hour that exists between one day and the next, the Hudson runs quiet and dark, holding its history and its secrets, indifferent to the empires that have risen and fallen on its banks, waiting with the patience that water has always possessed for whatever comes next.